A 12-year-old boy vanishes from a quiet town. His backpack is found at the gates of the most feared place in Garfield County, Black Ridge Warehouse, home to the Iron Vale Motorcycle Club. Every parent in Millhaven has warned their children about these men. Every teacher falls silent when the engines shake the windows. But tonight, two brothers will walk through those gates and discover a truth more dangerous than any rumor. The men behind those walls aren't hunting anyone. They're searching for a lost child. And what that child saw in the dark will put a target on everyone who tries to protect him. If you stay until the end, this story will change how you see every rider you've ever feared. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's ride. The first frost of November had already killed the grass along Route 31 when Mason Hale decided he hated Millhaven. It wasn't a dramatic realization. No single event triggered it. It had been building for months, layered into the marrow of his 12-year-old bones like cold settling into old wood. The town sat at the bottom of a valley in western Oregon, population just under 4,000, surrounded by timber country that hadn't produced real timber money in 2 decades. The main street had a hardware store, a diner called Patty's, a post office, a Baptist-turned-community center building with a cracked parking lot, and a gas station that doubled as the Greyhound stop. Everything else was either closed or closing. Mason walked with his hands buried in the pockets of a jacket 2 sizes too big. It had belonged to his father once. The zipper was broken, and the lining smelled like motor oil and something faintly chemical he couldn't name. Beside him, his younger brother Eli kicked a rock along the sidewalk with the concentration of someone performing surgery. Eli was 10. He didn't talk much anymore. Not since September, when their mother started working double shifts at the cannery in Ridgeport and stopped coming home before they fell asleep. Their father had been gone longer than that. 3 years. No letter, no phone call, no forwarded address. Just an empty parking spot where a blue Dodge Ram used to sit, and a closet full of clothes their mother hadn't touched. Mason had stopped expecting him to come back around the time Eli stopped asking when. The afternoon sky was the color of old concrete. Wind cut through the valley and pushed dead leaves across the road in dry, scratching bursts. School had let out 40 minutes ago, and most kids had already disappeared into houses or cars or the warm yellow light of Patty's diner. Mason and Eli walked alone. They always walked alone. Mason! Eli's voice was so quiet it almost disappeared under the wind. Yeah. Noah wasn't at pickup. Mason didn't slow down. Maybe his mom got him early. She never gets him early. She works till 5. That was true. Noah Mercer was in Eli's class, a skinny, dark-haired kid with glasses too big for his face and a bright green backpack covered in cartoon patches. His mother worked at the county clerk's office. His father was out of the picture entirely. Noah walked home the same route as the Hale brothers most days, splitting off at Birch Lane to head toward the east side of town. He was the kind of kid who talked too much about things nobody else cared about. Insects, weather patterns, the migratory habits of Canadian geese. Eli liked him. Mason tolerated him the way older brothers tolerate the friends of younger siblings, with a mixture of patience and mild irritation. He probably just went a different way, Mason said. Eli stopped kicking the rock. He looked up at his brother with an expression that was too old for his face. He never goes a different way. Mason felt something shift in his chest. Not fear exactly, more like the shadow of it, the outline of a feeling that hadn't fully arrived yet but was leaning against the door. They kept walking. The route home took them past the edge of town where the residential streets gave way to gravel access roads and old industrial lots. There was a feed store that had been closed for 2 years, a fenced lot full of rusted equipment, and beyond that, set back from the road behind a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, Black Ridge Warehouse. Every kid in Millhaven knew about Black Ridge. It sat like a scar on the landscape, a long, low-roofed building with corrugated metal walls stained by decades of rain and neglect. The parking lot was cracked asphalt, and on any given evening it was lined with motorcycles. Big ones, Harleys mostly, and a few custom builds that looked like they'd been welded together from salvage and spite. The sign above the main door read Iron Vale MC in faded white paint. Below it, someone had stenciled a winged gear with an anvil at its center. The Iron Vale Motorcycle Club had been in Millhaven longer than most of the families who complained about them. They'd moved into the warehouse sometime in the late 90s, and in the years since, they'd become the town's favorite ghost story. Parents used them as warnings. Teachers used them as cautionary tales. The sheriff mentioned them in every town council meeting as evidence of Millhaven's declining standards. Nobody knew exactly what they did inside that warehouse, and the not knowing had become its own kind of currency. Every rumor was worse than the last. Drugs, weapons, stolen cars, fight rings. Mason had heard all of it. He didn't know what was true and what was just the town talking to itself in the dark. What he did know was that the bikers kept to themselves. They didn't start fights at Patty's. They didn't bother kids walking home from school. Sometimes one of them would nod at Mason from across the gas station parking lot, and Mason would look away fast, the way you look away from a dog you're not sure is friendly. Today, as they approached the stretch of road that ran along the warehouse fence, something was different. Mason noticed it before he could name it. His feet slowed. His breathing changed. Eli bumped into his arm and started to say something, then stopped. Silence. Not the normal kind. Not the kind where things are just quiet. The kind where things should be loud and aren't. On any other afternoon, you could hear the warehouse from 100 yards out. Engines being tuned, music leaking through the walls, the clang of tools, the low murmur of voices. It was background noise, as constant and reliable as the river that ran behind the cannery in Ridgeport. Today there was nothing. No engines, no music, no voices, no clanging, just wind pushing through the razor wire and the faint tick of cooling metal from somewhere inside the lot. Mason's eyes swept the fence line. The motorcycles were there, at least a dozen of them, parked in their usual row along the south wall. But the main door was closed. The floodlights that usually came on at dusk were dark. The whole building looked like it was holding its breath. Mason. Eli's hand found his brother's sleeve. His fingers were cold. Look. He was pointing at the ground near the base of the fence, where the chain link met the cracked sidewalk. Something was wedged between the bottom rail and an old tire that had been sitting there so long it had sunk into the dirt. A backpack, bright green, covered in cartoon patches. One strap torn, the front pocket unzipped and hanging open like a mouth. Mason felt the world tilt. He didn't move for a long time. Neither did Eli. They stood there on the empty sidewalk with the wind cutting through their clothes and the gray sky pressing down, and Noah Mercer's backpack lying in the dirt like evidence of something they couldn't yet name. "That's Noah's," Eli whispered. "I know." "Mason, that's Noah's bag." "I know." The fear arrived then, not the shadow of it. The real thing. It came up through his stomach and settled behind his eyes like pressure before a storm. His mind raced through possibilities. Noah dropped it while walking by. Noah threw it over the fence as a joke. Noah was inside. Noah was hurt. Noah was gone. Every possibility led somewhere worse. "We should call someone," Eli said. Mason almost laughed. Call someone. Call who? Their mother was at the cannery and wouldn't check her phone until break at 8. They didn't have a father to call. The school office was closed. And the last time Mason had tried to talk to Sheriff Hagan about anything, a group of older boys who'd been stealing lunches from the younger kids at recess, the sheriff had looked at him like he was wasting oxygen and told him to stop being dramatic. That was Millhaven. You could scream into it and it would swallow the sound and give you nothing back. "We should go," Eli said, but he didn't move. Mason stared at the backpack. His heart was hammering. He could feel it in his wrists, in his temples, in the soft place at the base of his throat. Every cell in his body was telling him to walk away, to go home, to lock the door, and wait for their mother and let someone else deal with it. He was 12. He was tired. He was not equipped for this. But Noah was 10, the same age as Eli. And if Eli had vanished and his backpack was lying in the dirt outside a biker warehouse, Mason would want someone to not walk away. He crouched down and reached through the gap in the fence. His fingers closed around the strap. The backpack was cold and damp. One of the cartoon patches, a smiling frog holding an umbrella, was partially torn off. Inside the open front pocket, Mason found a pencil, half a granola bar still in its wrapper, and a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a math worksheet with Noah's name written in careful, slightly crooked handwriting at the top. No phone, no wallet, no clues beyond the fact that it was here and Noah wasn't. Mason stood up. He looked at the warehouse. He looked at his brother. "Stay here," he said. "No." "Eli, I'm not staying by myself." There was no arguing with that tone. Mason recognized it because it was his own stubbornness reflected back at him through a younger face. He nodded once, short and tight, and they walked together along the fence until they reached the main gate. The gate was heavy-gauge steel on rollers. It was closed, but not locked. A thick chain hung loose through the bars, the padlock open and dangling. Mason pushed the gate, and it moved with a low groan that seemed to carry across the entire empty lot. They stepped through. The parking lot felt enormous without sound to fill it. The motorcycles sat in their row, chrome, catching what little light leaked through the overcast sky. Oil stains spread across the asphalt like dark continents. The air smelled like diesel and something sharper, solvent maybe, or old paint. They made it halfway across the lot before the door opened. It didn't bang or slam. It swung open slowly, letting out a wedge of yellow light and the faint smell of coffee. A figure filled the doorway. He was enormous, not fat, built, shoulders that looked like they'd been designed to carry weight, and arms that stretched the seams of a worn leather vest covered in patches Mason couldn't read from this distance. His beard was gray and thick, braided at the chin. His hair was pulled back under a dark bandana. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than skin, all lines and angles and weathered planes. He looked at the two boys standing in the middle of his parking lot, and something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not suspicion, concern. "You're the Hale kids," the man said. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel poured over rust. It wasn't a question. Mason's mouth went dry. He didn't know how this man knew their name. He didn't know what to do with the fact that a biker twice his size was looking at him with something that resembled worry. "We found a backpack," Mason said. His voice came out thinner than he wanted. He held up the green bag. "It belongs to a kid named Noah Mercer. He's in my brother's class. He didn't come home from school." The man's expression changed. It was subtle, a tightening around the jaw, a shift in the eyes, the kind of controlled reaction that belongs to someone who has trained himself not to show what he's feeling. "I know who Noah is," the man said quietly. He stepped out of the doorway and crossed the lot in long, deliberate strides. Up close, Mason could see the patches on his vest more clearly. The top rocker read Iron Vale. The bottom one said Mill Haven. Between them, a name patch on the chest, Ronan, and below that, a rectangular patch that read President. Ronan Voss stopped 3 feet from the boys and looked at the backpack in Mason's hand. He didn't reach for it. He studied it the way someone studies a piece of evidence they've been dreading. "Where'd you find it?" he said. "By the fence, near the old tire." Ronan closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When he opened them, the concern had sharpened into something harder, something operational. "Come inside," he said. Mason didn't move. "Why do you know who Noah is?" It wasn't a challenge. It was a 12-year-old asking the only question that mattered. Ronan looked at him for a long moment, and Mason saw something in that look that he hadn't expected to see in the face of anyone in Millhaven. Not pity, not dismissal. Recognition. Like Ronan was seeing something in Mason that Mason hadn't yet seen in himself. "Because Noah's uncle rides with us," Ronan said. "His name is Declan Mercer. He's been looking for the boys since 3 o'clock this afternoon." The ground seemed to shift under Mason's feet. He turned to Eli, and Eli's eyes were wide, processing, recalculating. Everything they'd been told about the men inside this building, every warning, every whispered rumor, every sideways look from adults who spoke about the Iron Veil the way people speak about disease, was colliding with the fact that one of those men had spent the entire afternoon searching for a missing child. "How long?" Mason said. Since his school let out, Declan was supposed to pick him up. Noah never showed. "Did you call the sheriff?" Something dark moved through Ronan's face. A muscle twitched near his left eye. "We called. Hagen said the boy probably wandered off, said he'd send someone to check when he had a unit available." His voice carried a weight that Mason recognized but couldn't name yet. The weight of being dismissed by the people who are supposed to help. "That was 4 hours ago. Nobody came." Mason felt his hands tighten around the backpack straps. 4 hours. A 10-year-old boy had been missing for 4 hours, and the sheriff of Garfield County had decided it could wait. That was Millhaven. That was always Millhaven. "Come inside," Ronan said again. This time it wasn't a request. It was an acknowledgement that these two boys were already involved, and the cold was getting worse, and somewhere out in the growing dark, a child was alone. Mason nodded. He took Eli's hand, something he hadn't done in over a year, and they followed Ronan Voss through the steel door and into Blackridge Warehouse. The inside was nothing like what Mason had imagined. He'd expected filth, disorder, the kind of chaos that matched the stories people told. What he found was a workshop, a massive open space with concrete floors and high ceilings crisscrossed with steel beams. Along one wall, workbenches stretched end to end, covered in tools and engine parts organized with surprising precision. Pegboards held wrenches and socket sets in neat rows. A half-restored motorcycle sat on a hydraulic lift near the back, its engine disassembled in careful sequence across a steel table. The air smelled like coffee and motor oil and old wood, but none of that registered first. What registered first was the map. A large topographic map of Millhaven and the surrounding county had been spread across a wooden table at the center of the room. It was held down in the corners by coffee mugs and a motorcycle battery. Red marker lines divided the map into sectors. Each sector had a name written next to it in black ink. Routes had been traced along roads and trails with blue highlighter. A list of times was taped to one corner, check-in intervals, Mason realized. 30-minute windows. Around the table stood 7 men. They were different ages, different sizes, different degrees of weathered. What they shared was a quality Mason couldn't articulate, a stillness that didn't match their appearance. These were men who looked like they should be loud, but they were quiet, focused. Several had reading glasses pushed up on their foreheads. One was marking coordinates on the map with a mechanical pencil. Another was speaking into a handheld radio in a low, even voice. They all looked up when the boys entered. Nobody reached for a weapon. Nobody swore. Nobody asked Ronan why he'd brought 2 children into their space. They looked at the boys, then at the backpack in Mason's hand, and every face in the room underwent the same transformation, a rapid, controlled assessment followed by something that looked very much like urgency. A man near the far end of the table moved first. He was younger than Ronan, maybe early 30s, with dark hair cut short and deep-set eyes that carried a haunted, sleepless quality Mason had seen before. On his mother's face at 4 a.m. when she thought nobody was watching. His leather vest was unzipped over a gray thermal shirt. His hands were shaking. "Where?" he said. One word, aimed at the backpack like a bullet. "By the fence," Mason said. "Outside, near the tire." The man crossed the room in 4 steps. He took the backpack from Mason with hands that trembled so badly the zipper rattled. He opened it, looked inside, pressed the fabric against his face, and breathed in, and Mason watched a man who was clearly terrified try to become someone who was not. This was Declan Mercer, Noah's uncle, and he was breaking apart in a room full of men who were holding him together through sheer proximity and silence. "He was at the fence," Declan said, his voice cracking. "He was right here. He was this close." "Maybe he came this direction," Ronan said, calm, controlled, a voice built to hold other people steady. "He knows where you ride. He might have been trying to get here." "Then where is he?" Declan looked at Ronan with an expression that was equal parts rage and desperation. "Where the hell is he, Ronan?" Nobody answered. The radio crackled. Wind pushed against the metal walls and made them groan. Mason's mind was working. He didn't understand it at the time, wouldn't understand it for years, but something in him was already processing information the way certain people do under pressure. Not freezing, not panicking, sorting. "We heard dogs," he said. Every head turned. Mason swallowed. His throat was dry, and his heart was a fist pounding against his ribs, but the words kept coming. "After school, we were walking home. Before we got to the warehouse, about a quarter-mile back, there's that empty field past the old feed store. We heard dogs barking, not normal barking, aggressive." Eli stepped forward. His voice was small but certain. "It was weird, because there aren't any houses out there. No one has dogs out there." Ronan looked at Mason, then at Eli, then at the map. His finger landed on a section northeast of the warehouse, the area past the decommissioned feed store, where county land met an old logging road that hadn't been maintained in a decade. "That's a quarter-mile from here," Ronan said. "There's an access road. Leads to some old equipment sheds the county abandoned when they shut down the forestry program." The room shifted. Mason could feel it, a physical change in the density of the air, like pressure dropping before a storm. Every man in the room straightened. Hands moved to pockets, to belts, to tables where keys and flashlights sat. Ronan turned to a man near the radio. "Get every rider who's still out searching back here in 15 minutes. We're consolidating." The man nodded and began speaking into the radio with urgent efficiency. Ronan looked at Declan. "You ride with me. We go to the field first, then the sheds." Declan was already moving toward the door. Mason watched it happen. The transformation. One moment, these men were standing around a table. The next, they were a unit. Vests were zipped. Flashlights were tested. A man with a gray ponytail and a limp opened a cabinet and began distributing first aid kits and thermal blankets. Another man spread a hand-drawn sketch of the old equipment sheds across the table and pointed out structural details, entry points, collapsed sections, areas where a child might hide or get trapped. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody panicked. Nobody suggested they wait for the sheriff who wasn't coming. Mason recognized what he was seeing, even though he'd never seen it before. This wasn't chaos. This was training. These men had done this, not this exactly, but something like it, organizing under pressure, moving toward danger when everyone else moved away. They carried it in their bodies, in the economy of their movements, in the way they communicated with glances and single words instead of speeches. These were veterans. Not all of them, maybe, but enough. Mason could see it in Ronan's posture, in the way the man with the ponytail distributed supplies without being asked, in the radio discipline that was second nature to people who'd used radios when lives depended on clear communication. Millhaven had been afraid of these men for 20 years, and right now, these men were the only people in Garfield County who were actually looking for a missing child. "You two stay here," Ronan said to the boys. His tone wasn't cold. It was the tone of someone who cares about the answer. "There's coffee and there's a couch. Don't leave this building." "We want to come," Mason said. "I know you do, and that's exactly why you're staying." Mason opened his mouth to argue, and Ronan did something that stopped him. He put one hand on Mason's shoulder, just rested it there, heavy, warm, rough, with calluses. The weight of it went through Mason's jacket and settled into his bones, and for a brief, terrifying second, Mason felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Safe. "You did good bringing us that backpack," Ronan said. "You did good telling us about the dogs. Now let us do the rest." He turned and walked toward the door. 11 men followed him. Engines fired in the parking lot, a rolling thunder that built from individual growls into a unified roar that shook the windows and sent vibrations through the concrete floor and up through Mason's legs. Then they were gone. The warehouse fell silent. Mason and Eli stood alone in the enormous room, with the map on the table and the coffee machine hissing softly and the radio crackling with distant voices. Wind hammered the metal walls. The floodlights hummed above them, casting everything in a harsh, clinical white. Eli sat on the couch. It was old brown leather, cracked and soft, covered with a wool blanket that smelled like cigarette smoke. He pulled his knees up to his chest and wrapped his arms around them. "They're going to find him," Eli said. It wasn't a question. It was a demand he was making of the universe. Mason sat beside him. He didn't answer. He couldn't promise something he didn't know. Instead, he leaned his shoulder against his brother's and stared at the map across the room, at the red lines and blue routes and the handwritten names of men who were riding into the freezing dark to find a boy the sheriff had decided could wait. Minutes passed. The radio crackled and went quiet. Crackled and went quiet. Then, at exactly 7:42 p.m., a voice came through. Ronan's voice. 3 words. "We found something." Mason was on his feet before the static cleared. He grabbed the radio from the table, pressed the button with shaking hands, and said, "What? What did you find?" Silence. Then Ronan again, and this time his voice was different, harder, lower, The voice of a man who has seen something he wishes he hadn't. Get Declan off the radio. Now. Mason looked at Eli. Eli looked at Mason. Neither of them breathed. Through the thin walls of Black Ridge Warehouse, somewhere out in the frozen dark beyond the dead fields and the abandoned sheds, something had changed. And whatever Ronan Voss had found out there, whatever made a man like him drop his voice to a whisper and order his own rider off the channel, Mason understood with a clarity that felt like ice water in his veins. This was no longer about a missing boy. This was something far worse. The radio sat on the table between them like a living thing. Mason stared at it. His fingers were still wrapped around the handset, knuckles white, the plastic warm from his grip. Eli hadn't moved from the couch. The wool blanket was pulled up to his chin, and his eyes were fixed on some middle distance that didn't exist in the room. Ronan's last transmission replayed in Mason's skull on a loop. Get Declan off the radio. Now! The way his voice had dropped. The controlled urgency of a man who understood that certain information, delivered at the wrong moment to the wrong person, could detonate. Mason set the handset down. His hand was shaking. What does that mean? Eli whispered. I don't know. Is Noah? I don't know, Eli. The harshness in his own voice surprised him. He sat down on the edge of the couch and pressed his palms flat against his thighs to stop the trembling. The warehouse hummed around them. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, wind pushing against metal walls, the coffee machine gurgling through its cycle like it didn't know the world had changed. 7 minutes passed. Mason counted them on the clock above the workbench, a round industrial face with a cracked glass cover and a second hand that ticked with mechanical indifference. 7 minutes in which nobody spoke on the radio. 7 minutes in which the temperature outside continued to drop, and a 10-year-old boy was somewhere in the dark, and men on motorcycles were moving through frozen fields towards something Ronan Voss didn't want his own rider to hear. At 7:49, the radio came alive. Not Ronan's voice this time. Someone else, older, raspier, speaking with the flat cadence of a man reading coordinates. South shed, structure partially collapsed, east wall intact. We've got tracks. Multiple sets. Fresh. A pause. Static. Then another voice, younger, tighter. Confirmed. Tire marks on the access road, not ours. Someone's been driving out here, recently. Mason leaned forward. His heart was a hammer. Eli's hand found his arm and gripped it, and Mason let him hold on because they were both 12 and 10 and sitting in a biker warehouse at 8 o'clock at night, listening to things they shouldn't be hearing, and there was nobody else. The next transmission was Ronan. I need everyone to hold position. Do not approach the south shed. I repeat, do not approach. A breath. Declan, you copy? Silence. Declan. When Declan's voice came through, it was unrecognizable. The shaking was gone. In its place was something flat and featureless and infinitely more frightening. The voice of a man who had passed through fear and come out the other side into a territory where fear no longer applied. I'm already here, Declan said. Dec, listen to me. I can see the shed. The door's open. There's light inside. Do not go in. Do you hear me? Do not... The radio cut out. Mason stood up. He didn't decide to stand. His body did it for him, the way a body moves toward the edge of something because not knowing is worse than any answer. He crossed the room to the map table and looked down at the topographic lines and red sectors and found the area northeast of the warehouse where the old forestry shed sat at the end of the abandoned access road. His finger traced the route, a quarter mile, maybe less through the field. We could get there, he said. Ronan told us to stay, Eli said from the couch. I know what he said. Mason. Mason looked at his brother. Eli's face was pale under the fluorescent lights, his eyes enormous, his lower lip caught between his teeth. He looked exactly like what he was, a 10-year-old boy who was terrified and trying very hard not to show it. We're staying, Mason said. The words tasted like surrender. They waited. At 8:11, the first motorcycle came back. Mason heard it before he saw it. A single engine cutting through the darkness, growing louder, the rhythm uneven like the rider was pushing hard over rough ground. Headlights swept across the warehouse windows. The engine died. A door slammed. Boots on asphalt, fast, heavy. The warehouse door banged open and a man Mason hadn't seen before came through. He was mid-50s, stocky, with a shaved head and a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth in a thin white line. His vest said Briggs on the name patch. His hands were dirty. His breathing was ragged. He looked at the boys on the couch and his face did something complicated. Surprise, then calculation, then a decision to ignore their presence entirely. He went straight to the radio. "Ronan, it's Briggs. I'm back at the warehouse. Those tire tracks on the access road. I followed them out to the county connector. They turned south toward the industrial park off Route 7. He paused, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "I found something else. There's cargo. In the tree line about 40 yards from the south shed, wrapped in tarps, stacked. A lot of it." The radio hissed. Ronan's voice came back quieter than before. "How much?" "Enough to fill a box truck. Maybe two." Another pause. Mason could hear wind through the radio transmission, and beneath it, the faint sound of voices, men talking in low, urgent tones. "Get back out here," Ronan said. "And Briggs?" "Yeah." "Bring the first aid kit from the cabinet, the big one." Briggs didn't respond. He set the handset down and moved to the metal cabinet near the workbench. He pulled out a large orange case with a white cross on the lid and tucked it under his arm. Then he turned and looked at Mason and Eli for the first time. "You two, lock this door behind me. Don't open it for anyone who doesn't give you a name you recognize. You understand?" Mason nodded. "Say it." "We understand." Briggs left. Mason locked the door. The deadbolt was heavy and cold and made a sound like a bone breaking when it slid home. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make the silence worse. Mason sat on the floor with his back against the door, and Eli sat beside him, and they listened to Briggs's motorcycle roar to life and fade into the distance, and then there was nothing but the wind and the clock and the faint electrical hum of a building that suddenly felt very large and very empty. At 8:34, the convoy returned. Mason heard them a full minute before they arrived, a wall of sound that built from a distant rumble into a thundering chorus of exhaust and steel. He counted the engines. 11. Maybe 12. They filled the parking lot with noise and light, and then the engines died one by one, and what replaced them was worse. Voices, urgent, overlapping, the sound of boots on concrete moving fast. Someone giving orders in a tone that left no room for questions. A knock on the door, 3 sharp raps. "It's Ronan." Mason's hands fumbled with the deadbolt. He pulled the door open and the cold hit him first. A wall of November air that smelled like exhaust and frozen earth and something metallic he couldn't identify. Then the men came through. Ronan first, his face carved from granite, his eyes carrying a darkness that hadn't been there 2 hours ago. Behind him, 2 bikers Mason didn't know, supporting a third man between them. The third man was Declan, and Declan was not okay. His right hand was wrapped in a blood-soaked cloth. His face was cut above the left eyebrow, not badly, but enough to send a thin line of red down his cheek like a crack in porcelain. His eyes were wild and unfocused, darting around the room, searching for something. He was breathing in short, harsh bursts through his nose, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. They sat him on the couch. The man with the gray ponytail, Mason would later learn his name was Sullivan, opened the orange first aid case and began cleaning Declan's hand with practiced efficiency. Declan didn't flinch. He didn't seem to feel anything at all. "Where is he?" Declan said. "He's coming," Ronan said. "Cage and Wheeler have him. They're right behind us." "Is he hurt?" Ronan hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, less than a heartbeat. But Mason caught it, and Declan caught it, and the room caught it, and the temperature dropped 5 degrees. "Ronan." "He's alive, Dec. He's conscious. He's talking." "That's not what I asked." Another motorcycle pulled into the lot. Then another. The engines died and the door opened and 2 men came through carrying something between them, wrapped in thermal blankets. Mason's stomach lurched because for one terrible second it looked like they were carrying a body. And then the blankets moved and a small hand emerged and a voice said, in a thin, reedy whisper that barely qualified as sound, "Uncle Dec?" Declan was off the couch. He crossed the room in a movement so fast and so total that Sullivan's gauze strip went flying and the first aid kit slid off the cushion and hit the floor. He dropped to his knees in front of the two men, and they lowered the bundle into his arms, and Declan Mercer held his nephew against his chest and made a sound that Mason had never heard a grown man make. It wasn't crying. It was something beneath crying, a raw, gutted exhalation that came from a place where language doesn't reach. Noah was filthy. His glasses were gone. His clothes were torn at the knees and one elbow, and his skin was the color of old paper. His lips were cracked, and his hair was matted with dirt, and he was shivering with a violence that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than cold. But he was alive. He was conscious, and when his eyes found Mason and Eli across the room, he managed something that almost resembled a smile. "Hey," he said. Eli was crying. He hadn't made a sound, but tears were running down his face in steady streams, and his hands were shaking at his sides, and he looked at Mason with an expression that said everything and nothing at all. Mason didn't cry. He wanted to. The pressure behind his eyes was enormous, a weight that sat against the back of his skull like water behind a dam. But something in him had locked down, some mechanism that he didn't understand yet and wouldn't understand for years. And instead of tears, he felt a strange, cold clarity settle over him like frost on glass. He watched the men move around Noah with the same disciplined efficiency they'd shown all evening. Sullivan checked the boys' vitals. Another man brought heated water and clean towels. Someone produced a thermal sleeping bag and an energy bar and a thermos of warm broth. They worked without speaking, communicating through gestures and nods, a choreography of care that looked nothing like what Mason had been told about these men his entire life. 20 minutes later, Noah was wrapped in dry clothes borrowed from somewhere. A flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up 6 times and sweatpants cinched tight with a bungee cord. He sat in Declan's lap on the couch, drinking broth from a tin cup, and began to talk. His voice was thin and unsteady, breaking at odd intervals like a radio signal fading in and out. But the words were clear. He'd been walking home from school. Normal route. Birch Lane to Ridgefield, Ridgefield to the old feed store road. Then the shortcut through the empty field that shaved 4 minutes off the walk. He'd taken that shortcut every day for 2 years. Today, someone was in the field. 3 men. A white panel van backed up to the tree line near the old forestry sheds. They were unloading cargo, heavy, tarp-wrapped bundles that they stacked behind the trees. Noah hadn't understood what he was seeing. He'd stopped walking, standing in the open field like a deer in headlights, too confused to be scared. Then one of the men spotted him. Noah ran. He made it to the nearest shed, the south one, the one with the partially collapsed roof, and crawled inside through a gap in the east wall. He hid behind a rusted piece of equipment he couldn't identify, pressing himself flat against the concrete floor, his backpack caught on a piece of rebar. He'd pulled free and left it behind. He heard the men searching. He heard their voices, angry, tense, arguing about what to do. One of them wanted to find him. Another said it wasn't worth it, that the kid was just a kid, that they needed to finish unloading and get out. The third didn't speak at all. They searched for maybe 30 minutes. Then they left. Noah stayed. He stayed because he was afraid they'd come back. He stayed because his ankle was twisted from the fall through the wall gap, and it hurt to walk. He stayed because the sun went down, and the temperature dropped, and the dark was so complete that he couldn't see his own hands. He curled up in the corner of a concrete shed in November and waited for someone to find him. Nobody came. Not until the motorcycles. He'd heard them from inside the shed, that unmistakable Harley thunder cutting through the silence like a blade. He'd been too weak to shout, but when the flashlight beam swept through the cracks in the wall, he'd used what was left of his voice to call out. The room was quiet when Noah finished, the kind of quiet that has mass and texture. Men stood against workbenches and leaned on walls and sat on overturned crates, and every one of them was looking at the boy on the couch with the same expression, a particular mixture of fury and tenderness that seemed impossible to hold simultaneously, but that every man in the room was managing. Ronan was the first to speak. "Noah." His voice was so gentle it barely registered. "The men in the field, did you see their faces?" Noah shook his head. It was getting dark, but one of them had a red jacket, like a work jacket, and the van had writing on the side. I couldn't read all of it, but I saw the letters GRA and something about hauling. A ripple moved through the room. Mason didn't understand it, but the men did. He saw glances exchanged, quick, loaded, heavy with meaning. Briggs, the man with the scar, straightened against the wall where he'd been leaning and folded his arms across his chest. "Graylin," he said. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. "Don't," Ronan said. "Graylon Hauling, that's Alderman's outfit." "I said don't." "You know I'm right. White panel vans with green lettering, Graylon Hauling and Salvage. That's Ray Alderman's company. He's been running loads through this area for months. Half the county knows it. Half the county suspects it. That's not the same thing." "It's close enough." Ronan turned to face Briggs with a look that could have bent steel. "Nothing is close enough when a child is involved. We don't guess, we don't assume, and we do not take action based on what we think we know." The two men stared at each other across the room. Mason could feel the tension like heat from a furnace, invisible but absolute, pressing against the skin. Every other man in the room had gone still. Not the stillness of relaxation, the stillness of men watching a fuse burn. Briggs didn't blink. "So, what do we do? Call Hagen again? Wait another 4 hours for him to send a unit?" "We call the state police." "The state police don't operate in Garfield County without the sheriff's cooperation. You know that." "Then we go above him." "To who? The county commissioner? Dave Alderman." Briggs let the name hang in the air. "Ray Alderman's brother, the man who approved the county contract that gave Graylon Hauling exclusive rights to every municipal salvage job in the valley." The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was the silence of a room full of men arriving at the same conclusion at different speeds. Mason watched their faces change, watched realization settle over them like shadow, one by one, as the shape of the thing they were dealing with became clear. This wasn't a random crime. This wasn't strangers passing through. This was local, connected, protected. And Noah had seen it. Declan's arms tightened around his nephew. His jaw was working again, that grinding, cable-tight tension that looked like it could crack his teeth. He looked at Ronan with eyes that had moved past desperation into something colder, something patient. "He's a witness," Declan said. The words were flat, clinical. "My 10-year-old nephew is a witness to whatever alderman is running through those fields. And when those men don't find a scared kid waiting in the shed to be picked up, they're going to start asking questions about who he was and who he might talk to." "We don't know that," Ronan said, but his voice had lost its certainty. The granite was cracking. "The hell we don't." Declan's voice rose for the first time, sharp enough to make Noah flinch in his arms. He caught himself, lowered his volume, but the intensity didn't decrease. It concentrated like flame through a narrowing aperture. "They saw his face. They searched for him. They know he saw the cargo. And this is a town of 4,000 people, Ronan. How long before they figure out which kid walks through that field every day after school?" Nobody answered. Mason felt the cold clarity in his chest spread. It moved through his body like ice water through pipes, filling every space, pushing out everything warm and soft and childlike. He was 12 years old, and he was standing in a room full of dangerous men who were terrified. And the thing that terrified them wasn't the dark or the cold or the strangers in the field. It was the realization that the systems meant to protect people, the sheriff, the county, the law, were either absent or compromised. And the only thing standing between a 10-year-old boy and the consequences of what he'd seen was a motorcycle club that the entire town had spent 20 years despising. Ronan walked to the table. He placed both hands flat on the map and leaned forward, his weight on his arms, his head down. For a long moment he stayed like that. A man bearing a load that wasn't his, but that no one else was willing to carry. Then he straightened. "Sullivan?" The man with the gray ponytail looked up. "Call Dorsey at the State Bureau of Investigation. Use the landline, not the radio. Tell him we have a minor witness to what looks like organized theft and possible trafficking of stolen goods through county infrastructure. Tell him we believe local law enforcement may have a conflict of interest." Sullivan nodded and moved toward the back office. "Briggs." The scarred man uncrossed his arms. "Take Paulson and Vega. Go back to the access road. Don't touch the cargo. Don't approach it. I want eyes on it. If anyone comes back for it, I want plate numbers, descriptions, and timestamps. Nothing else. You do not engage. You do not confront. You watch. You understand me?" Briggs held Ronan's gaze for a 3 count. Then he nodded, a single, reluctant dip of the chin, and headed for the door. 2 men followed him. "The rest of you," Ronan said. "I want 2 riders on the north approach and 2 on the south connector. Nobody comes within a mile of this warehouse tonight without us knowing about it." Men moved. The room emptied in shifts, vests zipped, flashlights checked, radios tested. Within 3 minutes, the warehouse held only Ronan, Declan, Sullivan on the phone in the back office, and the 3 boys. Noah had fallen asleep in Declan's arms. The exhaustion had finally won. His breathing was slow and shallow, his face slack, his small fingers still curled around the tin cup of broth. Declan held him without moving, his injured hand forgotten, the blood-soaked cloth dark against Noah's sleeve. Ronan pulled a chair to the couch and sat down across from Declan. The 2 men looked at each other in the humming quiet of the warehouse, and Mason saw something pass between them that he wouldn't have the vocabulary for until he was much older. It was the look of 2 people who had been through something together before. Something worse than this. Something that had left marks they carried in their posture and their silences and the careful way they handled the people closest to them. "He can't go home tonight," Ronan said quietly. "I know. His mother needs to be told. I'll handle it. She's going to want to go to the sheriff." Declan's eyes flashed. "She doesn't know what the sheriff is." "Most people don't. Most people haven't had Hagen look them in the eye and say their missing nephew probably just wandered off." Declan's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a poison that Mason could taste. 4 hours. 4 hours he sat in that office doing nothing while my kid was alone in a concrete box in the dark. Ronan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped between them. "Listen to me. What you're feeling right now, I understand it. Every man in this room understands it. But if we move on that feeling, we give them exactly what they need to shut this down. The sheriff already has the town convinced we're criminals. One wrong step, and Hagen turns this from a missing child case into a motorcycle gang interfering with law enforcement. So we do nothing. We do everything. We just do it clean." Declan looked down at Noah's sleeping face. His expression shifted. Something breaking beneath the surface, tectonic and slow. The kind of fracture that doesn't make noise until the ground gives way. "The last time I was told to do it clean," Declan said, "I was 22. I was sitting in a VA office in Portland. They told me to be patient, fill out the forms, wait for my number, follow the process." He paused. His voice dropped to something Mason had to strain to hear. "I waited 11 months. By the time they processed my intake, I was living in my truck behind a gas station, and I hadn't slept more than 2 hours straight in 6 weeks. The process nearly killed me, Ronan. The clean way nearly killed me." Ronan didn't respond right away. He looked at Declan's wrapped hand, at the blood that had seeped through and dried in dark crescents along the gauze, at the cut above his eye, at the boy in his arms. "This isn't the VA," Ronan said, "and you're not alone this time." Something shifted in Declan's face, not a softening, more like a recognition, grudging, painful, that the man sitting across from him had earned the right to say those words. Mason didn't know the history between them. He didn't know what war they'd fought, or what they'd survived, or what had brought them to a warehouse in a dying Oregon town. But he understood, with the instinct of a child who had been let down enough times to know the difference, that these 2 men trusted each other the way people trust the floor, completely, and only because they'd tested the weight. Sullivan came back from the office. His face was tight. "Dorsey's not answering. His office says he's on assignment until Monday." Ronan straightened. "Monday. I left a message. Marked it urgent." "Monday is 3 days from now." "I know." The clock above the workbench read 9:17. Wind threw something metallic against the outside wall, a piece of loose siding, maybe, and the sound ricocheted through the warehouse like a gunshot. Everyone flinched, even Ronan. Mason watched the man recover, watched him pull the flinch back inside himself and replace it with that stone-cut composure. But for one moment, less than a second, Mason had seen something behind it. Exhaustion. Not the physical kind. The kind that comes from being the person everyone else leans on, year after year, decision after decision, until the weight becomes indistinguishable from the body carrying it. 3 days, Ronan said to the room. To no one. To the map and the coffee machine, and the empty couch cushions, and the 2 boys who shouldn't have been there but were. We hold for 3 days. His radio crackled, Briggs's voice, urgent, stripped of everything except information. Ronan. The cargo's gone. Ronan grabbed the handset. Say again. The cargo, the tarps, all of it. Gone. Tire tracks are fresh, 20 minutes old, maybe less. Someone came back while we were at the warehouse and cleaned the entire site. The room went still. Mason felt it, the moment when the situation changed shape, like watching a crack spread across ice. The cargo had been there 2 hours ago. Now it was gone, which meant someone had been watching. Someone had seen the motorcycles arrive and the flashlights sweep the field and the bikers carry a boy out of a concrete shed. Someone had waited until the iron veil pulled back to the warehouse, and then they'd moved. They knew. They knew the boy had been found. They knew who had found him. And they had cleaned the evidence. Ronan set the radio down. He looked at Declan. He looked at Noah, sleeping in his uncle's arms with the peaceful oblivion of a child who doesn't yet understand that the world has shifted beneath him. Then he looked at Mason. It was a look Mason would carry for the rest of his life. Not because of what it contained, though what it contained was significant, but because of what it asked. It asked a 12-year-old boy to understand something that most adults never have to face. That sometimes the people meant to protect you are the ones you need protection from, and the people everyone fears are the only ones willing to stand in the gap. You and your brother, Ronan said, you walked through that field today too. Mason's blood went cold. If they were watching the shed, Ronan continued, his voice careful and measured and terrible in its calm, they may have seen you, coming and going, before and after. Eli looked up from the couch. His face was white. Mason opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came, because there were no words for the thing that was crystallizing in his chest. The understanding that by picking up a green backpack and walking through a gate and telling the truth about barking dogs, he had placed himself and his brother inside a circle that was now closing, and the men who had cleaned that field in the dark knew exactly how small that circle was. Ronan stood. He crossed the room to the window and looked out at the empty parking lot, at the motorcycles standing in their row, at the darkness beyond the fence where the road ran toward the field and the sheds and the tree line where evidence had existed 2 hours ago and now didn't. Nobody leaves this warehouse tonight, he said. And somewhere out in the frozen dark, a white panel van with green lettering was already gone. Nobody slept. The warehouse existed in a state of suspended animation, lights on, coffee machine cycling endlessly, radios crackling at irregular intervals with check-ins from the riders posted along the north and south approaches. Mason sat on the floor near the map table with his back against a support beam, Eli's head on his shoulder, Eli's breathing the slow, uneven rhythm of someone fighting sleep and losing. Across the room, Declan sat motionless on the couch with Noah curled in his lap, the boy's face buried against his uncle's chest, his small body finally still beneath the thermal sleeping bag. Declan hadn't moved in 2 hours. His injured hand rested on Noah's back, the gauze dark with dried blood, his fingers slightly curled. His eyes were open, fixed on the middle distance, seeing nothing in the room and everything beyond it. Ronan stood at the map table. He'd been standing there since midnight. It was now 3:47 a.m. 5 hours and 47 minutes of a man staring at red lines and blue roots and the blank space northeast of the warehouse, where evidence used to exist and now didn't. He held a mug of black coffee in his left hand. He hadn't drunk from it. The surface had gone cold and a thin film had formed across the top like skin. The door opened at 3:52. Sullivan came through first, stomping mud from his boots, his gray ponytail dark and wet against the back of his neck. Behind him, Briggs, water streaming off his leather vest, his scarred face pinched against the cold. They'd been outside for 4 hours, watching the access road, the tree line, the empty field where the cargo had been. They brought the smell of November rain with them. It clung to their clothes and pooled on the concrete floor in dirty puddles. "Nothing," Briggs said. He didn't elaborate. He crossed to the coffee machine, poured a cup, and drank half of it standing up, his eyes closed, his jaw working like he was chewing the bitterness. Sullivan went to Ronan. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket and spread it on the map table. Mason couldn't see what it was from where he sat, but he watched Ronan's face as he looked at it, and what he saw made the cold in his chest spread. Ronan's expression didn't change. That was the tell. A man whose expression doesn't change when he should react is a man who has already processed the information and is now calculating consequences. "Where'd you get this?" Ronan said. "Taped to the gate." Mason straightened. The movement was involuntary, a spike of adrenaline overriding the exhaustion in his muscles. Eli stirred against his shoulder, mumbled something, and settled back. "When?" Ronan said. "Had to be between 2 and 3. Paulson was on the gate until 2. Vega took over at 2:15. There was a gap. A 15-minute gap." "Yeah." Ronan set his coffee down. He pressed both palms flat against the table and leaned forward, his weight on his arms, his head bowed. He stayed like that for exactly 4 seconds. Mason counted. Then he straightened and picked up the piece of paper and read it again. "Get everyone inside," he said. Sullivan hesitated. "Everyone?" "Every rider, every post. Now." Sullivan's face tightened, but he didn't argue. He keyed his radio and began issuing instructions in a low, rapid monotone. Within 8 minutes, motorcycles rumbled into the parking lot in pairs and threes, engines dying in sequence. Men came through the door, wet and cold and tired, stamping their boots, pulling off gloves, heading for the coffee machine with the mechanical focus of people operating on fumes. When the last man entered, Ronan closed the door himself, locked the deadbolt, turned to face the room. 14 men, 2 boys, 1 sleeping child. Ronan held up the piece of paper. "This was left on our gate sometime between 2 and 3 this morning." His voice was even, controlled, the kind of control that costs something. "It's addressed to the club. It references Noah by name. It references the shed. And it contains a specific instruction." He paused. The room was so quiet, Mason could hear the filament buzzing inside the fluorescent tube directly above him. "It says, 'Return the boy's silence, or we'll return for the boy.'" The words landed like concussion. Mason felt them physically, a pressure wave that moved through the room and hit every man in a different place. Declan's arms tightened around Noah. Briggs set his coffee cup down on the workbench with a careful deliberation that was more frightening than violence. Sullivan's hand went to his belt, not reaching for anything, just touching the leather, an unconscious gesture from somewhere deep in his training. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then Declan. Quiet. Flat. The voice of a man who has stopped being afraid and started being something else. "Who?" Ronan shook his head slowly. "No signature, printed on plain paper. Standard ink." "Graylon," Briggs said. Not a question this time. "We don't know that." "The hell we don't. Alderman's people cleaned the field. Now they're leaving threats on our gate. This is leverage, Ronan. They want the kid quiet because whatever was in those tarps is big enough to kill for." "Nobody's been killed." "Yet." The word hung in the air like smoke. Mason could feel it settling on his skin, into his clothes, into the marrow of the evening. Yet. The smallest word in the English language carrying the largest possible weight. Ronan turned to the room. His eyes moved from face to face, landing on each man long enough to establish something, contact, assessment, something Mason couldn't name. When his gaze reached Mason, it paused, held. And in that hold, Mason saw the thing that Ronan had been carrying all night, the knowledge that 2 children who weren't supposed to be involved were now at the center of everything, and every decision he made from this point forward carried their weight. "Listen to me," Ronan said. "All of you. This is a threat against a child. A 10-year-old boy. There is no version of this where we hand that boy over, where we silence him, or where we pretend we didn't find what we found. If anyone in this room thinks different, there's the door." Nobody moved. "What we are going to do," Ronan continued, "is protect this child and his family. We're going to protect the Hale boys who walked through that field yesterday and may have been seen. And we're going to do it without giving the sheriff or the county or anyone else a reason to paint us as the threat. Because that's what they'll do. That's what they always do. They'll flip it. The bikers intimidated the boy. The bikers staged the evidence. The bikers are the danger. Every one of you knows how this works. Every one of you has lived it. The room absorbed his words the way dry wood absorbs rain, slowly, reluctantly, with a grain that resists even as it takes the moisture in. Mason watched the men's faces. He saw agreement. He saw anger. He saw the particular exhaustion of people who have spent their lives being misunderstood and have learned to function inside that misunderstanding like fish in dirty water. And he saw something else, on one face. Only one. A man standing near the back wall, partially hidden behind the hydraulic lift. Mason hadn't noticed him before. Or rather, he had noticed him and then forgotten. The way you forget a piece of furniture that doesn't move. He was average height, lean, with a shaved head and pale eyes that caught the fluorescent light at an angle that made them look almost colorless. His vest said Kessler on the name patch. He stood with his arms at his sides, his weight on his heels, and his expression was wrong. Not angry, not tired, not concerned. Closed. The expression of a man listening to information he already possesses, calculating its distance from information he hasn't shared. Mason filed it away. He didn't know why. He was 12 and exhausted and scared, and the filing was instinct, the same instinct that had made him pick up Noah's backpack, the same instinct that had made him mention the barking dogs, the same instinct that would define the rest of his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Dawn came gray and wet. Rain had started sometime around 5, not heavy, but persistent. The kind of Oregon rain that doesn't pour so much as inhabit the air, turning everything damp and cold and vaguely miserable. The warehouse windows ran with water. The parking lot asphalt turned black and reflective. The motorcycles glistened under the security lights like chrome animals caught in the rain. Ronan had divided the night into shifts and tasks. Sullivan contacted Noah's mother using a prepaid phone Ronan kept in the back office. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Mason couldn't hear the words, but he could hear the tone through the closed door. Sullivan's low, steady cadence interrupted at intervals by a woman's voice that rose and cracked and rose again. When Sullivan emerged, his face was drawn and his eyes were red-rimmed. "She's coming here," he said. "Here?" Declan looked up for the first time in hours. "She doesn't want him at the house. She's scared. She said she saw a white van on her street yesterday morning." The detail moved through the room like electricity. A white van, on the street where Noah lived, before he went missing, which meant the men in the field hadn't stumbled across Noah by chance. They'd been operating near his route, near his home. For how long, nobody knew, but the implication was clear enough to tighten every jaw in the room. Declan's sister arrived at 7:15 a.m. Her name was Claire Mercer. She was 34, small, with dark hair pulled back tight, and eyes that looked like they'd been crying for hours and had run out of material. She came through the warehouse door and stopped. She looked at the motorcycles, and the workbenches, and the map table, and the men in leather vests, and the fluorescent lights, and her son sleeping on a couch wrapped in a stranger's flannel shirt, and something in her face fought between terror and gratitude, and settled on a trembling, precarious neutrality. She crossed to the couch. She knelt. She put her hand on Noah's forehead and made a sound so quiet it was barely a breath. Then she stood and turned to Ronan. "I want to call the police." "I understand that. I want to call them right now. Mrs. Mercer, my son was chased through a field and spent the night in an abandoned building, and someone taped a threat to your gate. I want the police." Ronan didn't flinch. "The sheriff was notified yesterday afternoon when Noah first went missing. He declined to respond." Claire's face changed. The neutrality fractured. "What do you mean he declined?" "I mean, Declan called the Garfield County Sheriff's Office at approximately 3:15 p.m. He was told your son had probably wandered off and that a unit would be dispatched when available. No unit was dispatched." "That's not—" Claire's voice broke. She pressed her hand against her mouth, hard, like she was physically holding the words in. Her eyes went to Declan. "Is that true?" Declan nodded. "Once." "And you didn't tell me?" "I was looking for him, Claire. I was trying to find him before you had to know he was gone." "You should have called me. You should have—" "And said what? Your son is missing and nobody gives a damn? You want to hear that while you're sitting in the county clerk's office filing paperwork for people who won't help you when it matters? The argument that followed was quiet and vicious, conducted in the low hissing register of family members who are too hurt to yell and too angry to stop. Mason and Eli sat against the support beam and listened to it the way they'd listened to their own parents fight before the silence came. Before the parking spot emptied and the closet stayed full and the fighting stopped because there was only one person left to fight. Ronan let it happen. He didn't intervene. He stood near the map table with his arms crossed and his face unreadable, and he let the Mercers burn through their anger because he understood, Mason could see it in his eyes, that the anger was necessary. That it was the sound of two people who loved the same child processing the fact that the world had failed him, and the only way through that processing was heat. When it was over, when Claire was sitting on the couch with Noah's head in her lap, and Declan was standing by the window with his back to the room, his injured hand pressed flat against the cold glass, Ronan spoke. Mrs. Mercer, I want to explain something, and I need you to hear it, because the decisions you make in the next few hours will determine your son's safety. Claire looked at him. Her eyes were dry now, emptied out, ready for information the way a hollow vessel is ready to be filled. The men who are in that field are connected to a local business called Greylon Hauling and Salvage. We believe, and I want to be clear that this is belief, not confirmed fact, that this company is being used to transport stolen goods through county infrastructure. The county commissioner, Dave Alderman, is the brother of the man who owns Greylon. Sheriff Hagen's department has received county funding tied to cooperative agreements with the commissioner's office. He let that settle. What I'm telling you is that there is a reasonable possibility, not a certainty, but a possibility, that calling the Garfield County Sheriff will result in your son's situation being mishandled, minimized, or redirected in ways that protect the people who threatened him rather than the people trying to keep him safe. Claire stared at him. Her hand moved slowly through Noah's hair, an automatic gesture, the muscle memory of comfort operating independently of the conscious mind. You're telling me I can't trust the police. I'm telling you I don't know if you can trust this particular sheriff, and I think you deserve to make that decision with full information rather than partial. The room waited. Rain drummed against the metal roof. Somewhere outside, a motorcycle engine coughed and died, one of the riders checking equipment, keeping the machines ready. Claire looked at her brother. Declan hadn't turned from the window. His reflection in the glass was ghostly, translucent, superimposed over the gray parking lot and the wet road beyond. Declan? He didn't move. Is he telling the truth? Declan's reflection closed its eyes. Hagen pulled me over 3 times in 2 months last year. No reason. No ticket. Just pulled me over, checked my license, ran my plates, and let me go. Every time he mentioned the club. Every time he made sure I knew he was watching. He paused. It's not proof, but it's a pattern. Claire's jaw tightened. She looked down at her son, at his dirty hair and his torn clothes and his cracked lips and his fingers curled loosely around nothing in his sleep. And Mason watched a transformation happen in real time. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was a mother arriving at the intersection of every fear she'd ever carried and every failure the world had delivered, and choosing the road that scared her most because the other roads had already proven they led nowhere. What do I do? She said. Ronan pulled a chair and sat across from her. At 9 a.m., Sullivan is going to drive you and Noah to the State Bureau of Investigation office in Salem. It's 90 minutes from here. You're going to file a report directly with state investigators, bypassing the county entirely. Declan will ride escort. 2 of my men will follow at a distance. And until then, you stay here. Noah stays here. The Hale boys stay here until we can reach their mother and make arrangements. Arrangements for what? For their safety. They walked through that field yesterday. If anyone was watching the shed when we pulled Noah out, those boys were visible. Claire looked at Mason and Eli as if seeing them for the first time. 2 children, sitting on a concrete floor in a biker warehouse at 7 in the morning, wearing yesterday's clothes, with the dark circles under their eyes, and the particular stillness of young people who have been awake too long and heard too much. How old are they? She whispered. 12 and 10, Mason said, because he could still answer for himself. Claire's hand stopped moving through Noah's hair. She pressed it against her own face. Her shoulders shook once, held, and then she was still. The morning stretched on. At 8:40, Sullivan left the back office and crossed to Ronan with the prepaid phone in his hand. His face carried an expression Mason hadn't seen on him before. Not concern, not urgency, but confusion. The confusion of a man encountering information that doesn't fit the framework he's built. "I got through to the SBI office in Salem," Sullivan said. "Spoke to the intake coordinator." "And?" "They already have a file." Ronan's head tilted, a fraction of an inch. The smallest movement carrying the largest question. "A file on what?" he said. "On Greylon hauling. Someone filed a complaint 6 weeks ago. Anonymous tip. Alleged misuse of county salvage contracts for unauthorized transport of goods across county lines. The file was opened, assigned to an investigator, and then—" Sullivan paused. "Closed. Closed. Closed by request. Internal review determined insufficient evidence to proceed." "Who requested the closure?" Sullivan looked at the phone in his hand like it had betrayed him. "The request came through a liaison in the Garfield County Sheriff's Office, a deputy named Wren. He provided a sworn statement that the allegations had been investigated locally and found to be baseless." The name dropped into the room like a stone into a well. Mason heard it hit bottom in the silence that followed. Wren. He didn't know the name, but every man in the room did. He could see it in the way their bodies changed, shoulders squaring, hands curling, eyes narrowing with the particular intensity of people hearing confirmation of something they'd long suspected but hadn't been able to prove. Briggs was the first to speak. "Deputy Martin Wren. Hagen's second. The man who handles every piece of paperwork that crosses the sheriff's desk. The man who decides which calls get answered and which ones don't. The man who didn't dispatch a unit when Declan called about Noah," Ronan said quietly. The room inhaled. "So it's not just Hagen," Declan said from the window. His voice had changed again, flatter, harder, the voice of a man who has been given the final piece of a puzzle he didn't want to solve. "It's institutional. The sheriff's office actively shut down a state investigation into the same operation that almost killed my nephew. We don't know it's institutional. Stop." Declan turned from the window. His eyes were wet, but his face was stone. "Stop protecting the possibility that these people are anything other than what they are. They ignored a missing child. They threatened a 10-year-old boy. They killed a state investigation to cover a theft ring. This isn't a few bad actors. This is the system we were told to trust, the system we were told would protect people like Noah." He looked at Claire. She looked back. And in that exchange, Mason saw the Mercer family arrive at the same place the Hale family had arrived 3 years ago. The understanding that the structures built to hold you up will sometimes let you fall, not by accident, but by design. Ronan stood. He walked to the back of the room, past the hydraulic lift, past the workbenches and the tool racks and the half-restored motorcycle that seemed to belong to a different world. He stopped at the far wall and turned around. And that was when Mason noticed. Kessler was gone. The lean man with the shaved head and the colorless eyes who had been standing near the hydraulic lift, the man whose expression had been wrong, whose stillness had been the wrong kind of still, was not in the room. His spot by the wall was empty. His vest was not among the others hanging on the pegs near the door. Mason scanned the warehouse. 14 men had been in this room 40 minutes ago. He counted the faces he could see. 13. "Where's Kessler?" Mason said. The words came out before he could stop them. They were loud in the quiet room, louder than a 12-year-old's voice should have been, cutting through the tension like a blade through fabric. Ronan froze. Briggs turned. Sullivan's hand tightened around the prepaid phone. Every man in the room performed the same rapid calculation Mason had just performed, and every man arrived at the same answer at the same time, and the room changed in a way that was physical. The air pressure dropping, the temperature shifting, something tectonic and irreversible moving beneath the surface. "When did he leave?" Ronan said. His voice was barely above a whisper. Nobody answered. Nobody had seen him go. He'd been there during the morning briefing. Mason was sure of it. He'd noticed the man's wrong expression, filed it away in whatever instinctive archive a 12-year-old keeps. But sometime between then and now, in the shuffle of Claire's arrival and the argument between the Mercers and Sullivan's phone calls, Kessler had moved through the room and out the door without a single person noticing. Ronan crossed to the pegs by the entrance. He checked each vest, counted them. His vest is gone. His keys are gone. He turned back. Briggs. When was Kessler's last radio check-in? Briggs pulled his radio log from his vest pocket, a small notebook with handwritten entries. He flipped pages with fingers that had gone white at the tips. Last check-in was 5:22 a.m. South Approach. He reported all clear. That was 3 hours ago. Yeah. And nobody thought to flag a missed check-in? The question was not accusatory. It was diagnostic. Ronan was mapping the failure, tracing the gap in the chain that had allowed a link to slip free. Briggs's face darkened, not with anger at Ronan, but with the sick recognition of a mistake made under exhaustion, a gap created by tired men doing too many things with too few hours of sleep. Ronan pulled out his radio. Kessler, check in. Static. Kessler, this is Ronan. Respond. Nothing. Kessler, respond on any channel. The radio breathed empty air back at him. Ronan set the handset down. He looked at Sullivan. Something passed between them. A communication that existed entirely in the movement of eyes and the tightening of jaws, and Sullivan nodded once, sharp, and disappeared into the back office. When he came back 90 seconds later, he was carrying a laptop. He set it on the map table and opened it and began typing with the focused intensity of a man searching for something he hopes he won't find. Kessler joined the club 14 months ago, Sullivan said, reading from what appeared to be the club's internal records. Transferred from a chapter in Bend. Came with references from the Bend president. A man named Gorecki. Passed the prospect period. No issues flagged. Pull Gorecki's information, Ronan said. Sullivan typed, waited, typed again. His face changed. Gorecki retired from the Bend chapter 8 months ago. Moved out of state. He paused. Forwarding address is a P.O. box in Medford. Another pause, longer this time. The phone number on file for Gorecki is disconnected. Ronan's hands were flat on the table again. That posture, weight forward, head down, the posture of a man bearing something that shouldn't be borne alone. When he looked up, his eyes carried a clarity that was almost violent in its precision. Pull Kessler's prospect application, the employment section. Sullivan scrolled. Found it, read it, and stopped breathing. Ronan. Say it. Previous employer, before the Bend chapter, before everything. Sullivan looked up from the screen. His face had gone the color of old ash. Graylon hauling and salvage. He worked for Alderman. The room detonated, not with sound, with silence. The kind of silence that follows an explosion, the ringing, pressurized void where sound used to be and hasn't yet returned. 14 men stood in a warehouse and understood, simultaneously and completely, that one of their own had been placed among them. That for 14 months, a man wearing their patch and sitting at their table and writing at their side had been watching them with colorless eyes and carrying information back to the people who were now threatening a child. Declan made a sound. It started low in his chest and built, not a word, not a shout. Something more primitive, the sound of a man whose trust has been weaponized. He set Noah down on the couch with a gentleness that contradicted every molecule of rage in his body, and then he stood and put his fist through the drywall beside the window. The impact was enormous. Dust erupted. A section of wall crumbled. Declan pulled his hand back. The injured one, the one already wrapped in bloody gauze, and blood ran fresh down his wrist, dripping onto the concrete floor in bright red drops that spread on impact like small, terrible flowers. Nobody stopped him. Nobody spoke. They let the violence happen because it needed to happen, because the alternative was worse. Ronan waited until the dust settled. Then he spoke, and his voice was the calmest thing in the room, which made it the most dangerous. This changes everything. He looked at the map, at the red lines and blue routes and the handwritten names of men he thought he could trust. Kessler knows our positions. He knows our radio frequencies. He knows our watch rotations and our approach routes and the location of every man in this club at any given time. He knows Noah is here. He knows the Hale boys are here. He knows Claire is here. Each sentence was a nail driven into wood, and right now he is delivering that information to whoever left that note on our gate. Ronan looked at Mason, at Eli, at Noah sleeping on the couch, at Claire, who was holding her son's hand with both of hers, her face a mask of control stretched over a geography of terror. We have to move. All of us. Right now. Before Kessler tells them where we are and how few of us are left to stand in the way. He reached under the map table and pulled out a black duffel bag. He unzipped it and began removing items, flashlights, radios, keys, a stack of prepaid phones still in their packaging. He worked with the precision of a man who had prepared for this moment without knowing when it would come. Sullivan, get the van from the back lot. Declan, carry Noah. Claire, you ride with Sullivan. Briggs, I need you to take the Hale boys on your bike. No, Mason said. Every head turned. Mason stood in the middle of the warehouse floor. He was 12 years old. He was exhausted. His jacket smelled like motor oil, and his hands were shaking, and his brother was pressed against his side like a smaller version of himself made of the same fear and the same refusal to be moved by it. We're not leaving without calling our mom. Ronan looked at him. The look lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Mason watched Ronan Voss, president of the Iron Vale Motorcycle Club, combat veteran, the man who had held this room together through a night of threats and revelations and betrayal, recognize something in a 12-year-old boy that he recognized in himself. The refusal to be carried. The insistence on standing even when standing was the harder choice. Sullivan, Ronan said, without breaking eye contact with Mason. Give him the phone. Mason took the prepaid phone. He dialed his mother's number, the only number he knew by heart, the number he'd memorized the day his father left because he understood, even at 9, that there might come a time when it was the only number that mattered. It rang 4 times. She answered on the 5th. Mom, Mason said. His voice cracked on the word. Just once. Just enough. I need you to listen to me, and I need you to not ask questions until I'm done. Outside the warehouse, the rain had turned to sleet. It hit the metal roof in a continuous rattle, like fingers drumming on a table, like the sound of something patient and relentless arriving from a direction nobody was watching. And 3 miles south, on the county connector that ran parallel to Route 7, a white panel van with green lettering had already pulled over to the shoulder, where a man with a shaved head and colorless eyes was climbing into the passenger seat, carrying 14 months of secrets and the exact location of every person the Iron Vale Motorcycle Club was trying to protect. Mason's mother arrived in 19 minutes. He knew this because he watched the clock above the workbench with the focus of someone counting down to detonation. 19 minutes from the phone call to the sound of tires on wet asphalt outside the warehouse. 19 minutes in which Ronan had mobilized every resource the Iron Vale possessed. 2 vehicles loaded, routes mapped, contingencies assigned, radios distributed to every rider with fresh batteries and specific channel assignments. 19 minutes in which the sleet continued to hammer the metal roof and the temperature continued to drop, and somewhere on a county road 3 miles south, a man with colorless eyes was delivering the club's secrets to people who had already threatened a child. The door opened and Linda Hale came through it like a woman walking into a burning building, terrified and moving forward anyway. She was 37 but looked older, the way single mothers working double shifts at canneries in small Oregon towns tend to look older. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot. She wore a cannery uniform under an unzipped parka, and her hands were red and chapped from the processing line. Her eyes found her son's immediately, the way a compass finds north. Not searching, not scanning, just locking on with a precision that bypassed thought entirely. She crossed the room in 5 steps and dropped to her knees and pulled both boys into her arms. She didn't speak. She held them with a force that compressed Mason's ribs and pressed Eli's face into her shoulder and communicated everything she couldn't say through the pressure of her grip and the shaking of her body. Mason let her hold him. For 3 seconds, he was 12 again. Just 12. Not a boy who had spent the night in a biker warehouse listening to radio transmissions about threats and betrayal, and a mole who had been watching them all for 14 months. Just a kid whose mother had come. Then the 3 seconds ended, and the world reasserted itself. Mom? He pulled back. We have to go. Linda looked at him. Then she looked around the warehouse, at the men in leather vests, at the map table covered in red lines and coffee stains, at the woman on the couch holding a sleeping child, at Ronan Voss standing near the door with a black duffel bag at his feet and an expression that belonged on the face of someone much older. "Someone needs to tell me what's happening," she said. Her voice was steady. Mason recognized the steadiness. It was the same controlled flatness she used when the bills were overdue, or the car wouldn't start, or the landlord called about the rent. The voice of a woman who had learned to function inside crisis the way other people function inside routine. Ronan told her. He was efficient and direct, and he didn't soften anything. He told her about Noah, about the field, about the cargo, about the threat on the gate, about Kessler, about the sheriff's office killing the state investigation. He told her that her sons had walked through that field and might have been seen, and that a man who had been inside this building for 14 months had just delivered their location to people with the resources and the motivation to ensure that a 10-year-old witness never testified. Linda listened without interrupting. Her face went through several changes: shock, disbelief, anger, fear, and then settled into something that Mason had never seen on her before. It was the expression of a person who has been given information that reorganizes their understanding of the world and who is choosing in real time how to respond. "Where are we going?" she said. Not why, not how, not who are you to tell me what to do. Where? Ronan's eyes changed, just slightly, a micro-expression that might have been respect. "Sullivan has a cousin in Cressfield, 40 miles east, a ranch property. Private road, gated access, no neighbors within 2 miles. We take the families there. The club stays mobile between here and Cressfield as escort and early warning. And then what? And then we wait for the State Bureau of Investigation to open on Monday morning, and we walk through their front door with Noah Mercer and his mother and every piece of information we have. That's 2 days from now." Yes. Linda looked at her sons, at Mason's 2 old eyes and Eli's pale, exhausted face, at their dirty clothes and their unwashed hair and the way they leaned into each other like 2 halves of something that couldn't stand alone. "Let's go," she said. They moved fast. Sullivan brought the van around, a battered gray cargo van with tinted windows and no markings, the kind of vehicle that existed in the space between civilian and invisible. Claire and Noah went in first, Noah still wrapped in the thermal sleeping bag, his eyes half open, his body compliant with the practiced surrender of a child who has learned to let adults carry him through things he doesn't understand. Linda and the boys climbed in next. Declan sat in the passenger seat, his injured hand re-wrapped by Sullivan with fresh gauze that was already showing spots of red. Ronan leaned through the driver's window. Route 12 east to the Sawyer Creek Junction, left on the Creek Road, 4 miles to the property. Gate code is 7734. Sullivan knows the way. Sullivan nodded. He was calm the way medics are calm, the professional serenity of someone who has been trained to function when others can't. "I'll have riders on your 6 the whole way. Briggs leads, Paulson trails. If anything happens, anything, you put your foot on the gas and you do not stop until you reach that gate." Sullivan started the engine. "Ronan," Declan's voice from the passenger seat, low, strained, the voice of a man speaking through clenched teeth in a pain that went deeper than his hand. "What about Kessler?" Ronan's jaw tightened. The muscles along his neck stood out in the gray morning light. Rain ran down his face and dripped from his beard, and he didn't wipe it away. "I'll handle Kessler," he said. The van pulled out. Behind it, Briggs's motorcycle fell into position, a single headlight cutting through the sleet, steady and unwavering, like a lighthouse beam aimed at the road ahead. Behind Briggs, 2 more riders. Behind them, Paulson, riding tail, his head swiveling at every intersection, every driveway, every gap in the tree line where a vehicle might be waiting. Mason sat in the back of the van with his face pressed against the cold window, watching the motorcycles through the rain-streaked glass. The Harleys moved in formation, precise, practiced, the spacing between them consistent despite the wet road and the limited visibility. They communicated through signals Mason couldn't read, hand gestures, head tilts, brief flashes of brake lights that carried meaning beyond their mechanical function. Millhaven disappeared behind them in minutes. The town gave way to County Road. 2 lanes of cracked asphalt cutting through timber country, dense stands of Douglas fir pressing close on both sides, their branches heavy with water, the forest floor invisible beneath layers of fog that clung to the ground like something living. The road climbed, dropped, curved. The van's headlights carved tunnels through the gray, and the wipers beat a rhythm that was too steady, too mechanical, too normal for what was happening inside the vehicle. Nobody spoke. Claire held Noah. Linda held Eli. Mason sat alone on the wheel well behind the driver's seat, his hands flat on his thighs, his eyes moving between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. He was watching for a white panel van with green lettering. He was watching for anything that didn't belong. At mile 6, he saw it. Not a van, a truck. A dark blue pickup sitting in a pull-off on the north side of the road facing their direction. Engine running. Mason could see the exhaust plume in the cold air, a white column rising from the tailpipe and dissipating into the fog. The cab was occupied. 2 figures. They weren't looking at their phones or eating breakfast or doing any of the things people do when they pull over on a rural road at 8 in the morning. They were watching. Mason's hand moved to the back of Sullivan's seat. He gripped the fabric. Blue truck. Right side. 2 people. Sullivan's eyes flicked to the mirror. Back to the road. His hands adjusted on the wheel, a subtle shift. 10 and 2 becoming 9 and 3, the grip of a man preparing to drive fast. I see it, he said. The van passed the truck. Mason turned in his seat and watched through the rear window. For 3 seconds, the truck didn't move. Then its headlights came on and it pulled onto the road behind them. He's following, Mason said. Declan reached for the radio on the dashboard. Briggs, blue pickup, just entered the road behind Paulson. Briggs's voice came back immediately. Copy. I see him. He's maintaining distance. Quarter-mile back. Just watching? For now. The radio clicked off. The van's engine pitched higher as Sullivan pressed the accelerator. The speedometer climbed. 50. 55. 60 on a road rated for 45. The tires hissing on wet asphalt. The van's body swaying on curves that came faster as the road wound deeper into the timber country. Mason kept his eyes on the rear window. The blue truck maintained its distance. Quarter mile. Never closer. Never farther. A satellite locked in orbit. Then, at mile 9, a second vehicle appeared. White panel van. Green lettering. It came from a side road, a logging access that wasn't marked on any map Mason had seen, and slotted in behind the blue truck with the smooth precision of a choreographed maneuver. 2 vehicles now. Following. Watching. Waiting. Second vehicle, Mason said. His voice had gone flat. He didn't recognize it as his own. White van, green letters. The radio erupted. Paulson's voice, tight and clipped. Ronan, you on this channel? Ronan came back from somewhere behind them. His motorcycle was somewhere in the formation, but Mason hadn't been able to pick out which headlight was his. I'm here. 2 tails, blue Dodge pickup, plates obscured. White Greylon van, plate Golf Romeo Alpha 271. They're pacing us. How many in the van? Can't tell. Windows are tinted. At least 2 in the truck. A pause. Rain against metal. Engines in the fog. Maintain formation, Ronan said. Sullivan, increase speed to 70. You've got a straight stretch coming up in half a mile. When you hit the Sawyer Creek junction, take the turn hard and don't slow down. Sullivan didn't respond verbally. The van surged forward. 70 on a wet county road in fog, the vehicle shuddering on its suspension, Linda pulling both boys against her body, Claire pressing Noah's head against her chest and covering his ears with her hands as if she could shield him from the sound of what was happening. Mason braced himself against the van wall. His heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. Through the rear window, the 2 vehicles behind them had accelerated to match. The quarter mile had become 1/8 of a mile. He could see the truck's grille now, chrome and flat and aggressive, eating up the distance. They're closing, he said. I see them. Sullivan's voice hadn't changed. That professional calm, unbreakable, infuriating in its steadiness. Junction in 90 seconds. The road straightened. For half a mile, the timber fell back and the county road ran flat and exposed through an open stretch where the fog was thinner and the visibility was better. Better for them. better for the vehicles behind them. The white van accelerated. It moved into the oncoming lane and began to pull alongside the motorcycle formation. Mason could see it through the side window now, the green lettering on the side panel, Graylin hauling and salvage, the tinted windows reflecting nothing, the van's engine roaring as it pushed past the trailing riders. Briggs's motorcycle swerved, not away from the van but toward it, a controlled, aggressive maneuver that forced the van back into its lane. The van's horn blasted. The sound was enormous in the fog, a flat, angry bellow that echoed off the tree line and sent something primal through Mason's nervous system. "Briggs, do not engage," Ronan's voice on the radio, sharp now, the calm fraying at the edges. "Do not engage. He's trying to get alongside the van." "I know what he's trying. Hold formation, 30 seconds to the junction." Mason counted. He didn't mean to. His brain did it automatically. A mechanism for managing terror, converting chaos into numbers, imposing order on a situation that had none. 30, 29, 28. The junction appeared through the fog like a wound in the road, a hard left where the county road met Sawyer Creek Road, marked by a leaning green sign and a concrete drainage culvert and a guardrail that had been hit so many times it curved inward like a broken rib. Sullivan took the turn at 60. The van leaned, hard, the right side lifted. Mason felt gravity shift, felt himself slide across the metal floor, his shoulder hitting the wheel well, Eli's body pressing against his, Linda's arm across both of them, like a seatbelt made of bone and muscle and will. Tires screamed on wet asphalt. The rear end broke loose for a fraction of a second, a sickening, weightless moment where the laws of physics debated whether to keep them on the road. And then the tires caught, and the van straightened, and Sullivan's foot went back to the floor. Behind them, the motorcycle formation took the turn in sequence. Briggs first, then two riders, then Ronan, then Paulson. They leaned into the curve with the practiced synchronization of men who had ridden together in conditions far worse than this. Their boots inches from the wet asphalt, their machines extensions of their bodies. The blue truck took the turn wide, too wide. Its back end swung out and caught the guardrail with a metallic shriek that carried through the fog like a scream. The truck spun, not a full rotation, 90 degrees, maybe less, but enough to block the road, and the white van behind it had to brake hard, tires locking on the wet surface, the vehicle sliding sideways across both lanes in a spray of water and gravel. "They're off the road," Paulson reported. "Both vehicles." Truck hit the rail. Van stopped sideways. Injuries? Can't tell. Not stopping to check. The formation accelerated away. Sawyer Creek Road was narrower than the county road, 1.5 lanes of worn blacktop cutting through dense timber, the creek itself visible through gaps in the trees as a swollen brown ribbon running fast with November rain. The road curved and climbed and dropped, and with every turn the distance between them and the junction grew, and Mason felt something that wasn't quite relief, but was adjacent to it, a loosening of the wire that had been tightening around his chest for the past 20 minutes. It lasted 45 seconds. Declan's hand shot up. He pointed through the windshield at something ahead, around the next curve, barely visible through the fog and the rain, a shape that didn't belong on a rural road at 8:30 in the morning. A vehicle, parked sideways across both lanes, a dark sedan with its lights off and its engine running, positioned at the apex of a blind curve where the tree line pressed close and the road narrowed to barely one lane. A blockade. Sullivan hit the brakes. The van decelerated hard, ABS pulsing through the pedals, the vehicle shuddering as physics and rubber and rain negotiated a compromise. They stopped 30 feet from the sedan. The motorcycles behind them fanned out, engines idling, headlights cutting through the rain in white columns that illuminated the sedan and the road and the trees and the fog in harsh theatrical clarity. Nobody moved for 10 seconds. Then the sedan's doors opened. Both of them. 2 men stepped out. The first was tall and heavy, wearing a work jacket, red, Mason noted, his stomach dropping, and jeans and boots caked with mud. He stood behind the driver's door with his arms crossed, his face partially hidden by the doorframe. The second was shorter, thinner, wearing a Garfield County Sheriff's Department uniform. The badge caught the headlight beam and threw it back in a cold silver flash. His hand rested on his belt, near but not on the service weapon holstered at his hip. His face was narrow and sharp, with the expression of a man who has practiced authority until it became indistinguishable from personality. Deputy Martin Wren. The radio in Declan's hand crackled. Ronan's voice. "Nobody move, nobody speak, I'll handle this." Mason watched through the windshield as Ronan dismounted his motorcycle. He walked forward through the rain, unhurried, deliberate, his boots splashing in the shallow puddles that had formed on the road. Water ran down his leather vest and dripped from the braids in his beard. He stopped 10 feet from the sedan and stood in the road with his hands at his sides, visible, empty, unthreatening. "Deputy," Ronan said. Wren stepped around the sedan door. Up close, even through the rain-streaked windshield, Mason could see the man's face clearly. The sharpness, the calculation, the eyes that moved like a camera taking inventory. "Ronan Voss, you're blocking a public road. I received a report of a stolen vehicle matching the description of your van. I'm conducting a traffic stop. This van isn't stolen. I'll need to verify that, license, registration, and I'll need everyone to step out of the vehicle." From inside the van, Mason heard Claire's breathing change, shallow, fast. The breathing of a person whose body has decided that the situation is no longer manageable. Noah stirred in her arms and made a small sound. Not a word, not a cry, something between a whimper and a question. Ronan didn't move. He stood in the rain and looked at Deputy Wren with an expression that carried no anger, no challenge, no visible emotion at all. Just a steady, unbreakable attention that seemed to see through the uniform and the badge and the practiced authority to something underneath. "There are 3 children in that van," Ronan said. His voice was quiet. Not soft, quiet. The quietness of a man who knows that volume is unnecessary when the words themselves carry sufficient weight. 2 of them are minors who have been awake for over 20 hours. One of them is a 10-year-old boy who was lost in the woods last night after being chased by men operating out of a field near Black Ridge. Wren's face didn't change, not a flicker. "I don't know anything about that." "I think you do." "Are you refusing to comply with a lawful traffic stop?" "I'm telling you what's in that van so you can make an informed decision about what happens next." The 2 men stood in the rain, 15 feet apart. The headlights from the motorcycles threw their shadows long and angular across the wet asphalt, Ronan's massive and still, Wren's narrow and taut. The man in the red jacket hadn't moved from behind the sedan door. He was a presence, not a participant, a reminder. Wren's hand moved closer to his belt. The motorcycle engines behind the van dropped in pitch, not revving, not threatening, adjusting. The sound changed from individual engines to something unified, a low harmonic rumble that vibrated through the road surface and up through the van's chassis and into Mason's bones. It wasn't aggressive. It was communicative. The sound of 12 machines and 12 men saying, without words, that they were present and they were not leaving. Wren heard it. Mason saw him hear it, saw the deputy's eyes move past Ronan to the formation behind the van, counting headlights, calculating numbers, performing the arithmetic of confrontation. "I'm going to need you to—" "Deputy Wren." Ronan's voice cut through the rain. Still quiet, still controlled, but something new in it now. An edge that hadn't been there before, like a blade being drawn from a sheath slowly enough to hear the metal sing. 6 weeks ago, an anonymous complaint was filed with the State Bureau of Investigation regarding gray lawn hauling and salvage. That complaint was assigned to an investigator. It was then closed at the request of the Garfield County Sheriff's Office. The request was filed by you. Wren's hand stopped moving. Last night, a 10-year-old boy witnessed men operating from a gray lawn vehicle, unloading cargo in a field adjacent to county infrastructure. Those men chased the boy. He hid in an abandoned shed for hours. When we found him, a threat was left on our property, instructing us to keep the boy silent. The rain fell. The engines hummed. The man in the red jacket shifted his weight behind the sedan door. In approximately 48 hours, Ronan continued, that boy and his mother will walk into the State Bureau of Investigation office in Salem. They will reopen the file you closed. They will provide testimony regarding what the boy saw. and they will name every individual who attempted to obstruct, intimidate, or silence a child witness. Ronan took one step forward, just one. The distance between him and Ren compressed from 15 feet to 12, and in that compression, something changed. Some invisible boundary shifted, some equation rebalanced. You can step aside, or you can add obstruction of a material witness to whatever else is coming your way. But you should know that a detailed summary of tonight's events, including your failure to dispatch a unit for a missing child, your closure of the state investigation, and your presence on this road at this hour, has already been transmitted to a contact at the state level who is expecting a follow-up call at 9 a.m. Monday morning. Ren's face underwent a transformation. It was subtle, the kind of change that happens beneath the skin, in the muscles that control expression rather than the expression itself. His jaw shifted, his eyes narrowed. The hand near his belt opened, fingers spreading, then slowly moved to his side. "You're making a mistake," Ren said. "I've been told that before. These people you're protecting, you think they'll thank you? You think this town is going to throw you a parade? You're bikers. You're criminals to them. You always have been. When this is over, they'll go back to crossing the street when they see you coming." Ronan stood in the rain. Water poured off him. His vest was black with it. His beard dripped. His eyes held Ren's with a steadiness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the moment, from years of standing in places exactly like this, hearing words exactly like these, and choosing to remain anyway. "Move the car," Ronan said. 10 seconds passed. Mason counted every one. His heart was a fist inside his chest, pounding against the cage of his ribs with a violence that felt like it might break through. Eli had buried his face in Linda's jacket. Claire was whispering something to Noah, something Mason couldn't hear, something that sounded like a lullaby, or a promise, or both. Ren looked at the motorcycles one more time, counted the headlights one more time, performed the arithmetic one more time. Then he turned to the man in the red jacket and jerked his head toward the sedan. The man got in. Ren got in. The engine revved. The sedan pulled forward, swinging off the road and onto the shoulder, its tires churning through mud and gravel, leaving just enough space for the van to pass. Sullivan didn't hesitate. The van moved forward through the gap, close enough that Mason could have reached out the window and touched the sedan's mirror. Ren's face was visible through the driver's window for 1 second, pale, tight, furious, and then they were past. The motorcycles followed, one by one, each rider passing the sedan at idle speed, unhurried, unafraid, the combined rumble of their engines filling the narrow road like a statement that required no translation. Mason watched through the rear window until the sedan disappeared around the curve. Then he turned forward and pressed his forehead against the cold metal wall of the van and breathed. The ranch gate appeared 7 minutes later. Sullivan punched the code. The gate swung open. The van rolled up a private gravel road bordered by fenced pasture and old-growth timber, and at the end of the road stood a farmhouse, white clapboard, green roof, porch light on, smoke rising from a chimney into the gray November sky. They unloaded in silence. Claire carried Noah up the porch steps. Linda walked the boys inside. Sullivan spoke briefly with a woman at the door, his cousin, Mason assumed, and then disappeared back to the van for supplies. Ronan was the last to enter the property. He stood at the gate for a long time, his motorcycle idling beneath him, the rain running off his shoulders in sheets. He was looking back down the road they'd come from, watching, listening, making sure. Then he killed the engine and walked his bike through the gate, and Sullivan closed it behind him, and the lock engaged with a sound that Mason felt in his teeth. Inside the farmhouse, someone had lit a fire. The warmth hit Mason like a physical force, a wall of heat and light and the smell of wood smoke and something cooking, something ordinary and impossible, soup or stew or whatever people made in kitchens when the world outside was falling apart. Eli was already on the couch, wrapped in a quilt, his eyes closing. Linda sat beside him, stroking his hair, her own eyes fixed on some middle distance that contained everything she'd learned in the last hour, and everything she hadn't yet processed. Mason didn't sit. He stood by the window and looked out at the gravel road and the gate and the men on motorcycles who were positioning themselves along the fence line, silent figures in the rain, stationing themselves at intervals, facing outward, watching every approach. Ronan came up the porch steps. His boots were heavy on the wood. He stopped at the door and turned and looked back at his riders, at the men who had followed him through a night of threats and betrayal, and a confrontation with a corrupt deputy on a blind curve in the rain, and something passed across his face that Mason would remember for years. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something more private. The expression of a man who knows that the people standing with him have chosen to stand there, and that the choice itself is the only thing that matters. He came inside. He pulled the door shut. His radio crackled. Briggs, urgent. Ronan, Paulson just intercepted a county band transmission. Sheriff Hagan has issued a bolo on the van, description matches ours, listed as a suspected vehicle involved in the abduction of a minor child. The room stopped. Mason turned from the window. Linda looked up from the couch. Claire appeared in the kitchen doorway with Noah clinging to her leg. Ronan held the radio at his side. Water dripped from his vest onto the hardwood floor. His face was stone. His eyes were furnaces. "They're flipping it," he said. Quiet, controlled, devastated. "They're saying we took the boy." The words settled over the room like ash after an explosion. Every person processed them at a different speed and arrived at the same destination. The Iron Veil hadn't just been outmaneuvered, they'd been rewritten. In the narrative now being broadcast across every law enforcement frequency in the county, they weren't protectors. They were kidnappers. They weren't saving a child. They were taking one. And every mile they'd driven, every turn they'd taken, every moment of the last 12 hours was now evidence in a story they hadn't written and couldn't control. Ronan set the radio on the table. He looked at Sullivan, he looked at Declan, he looked at Claire and Linda, and the three children who were watching him with eyes that carried a question none of them knew how to ask. "Sullivan," Ronan said, "call Dorsey again, State Bureau. Emergency line. If he doesn't answer, call his supervisor. If the supervisor doesn't answer, call the governor's office. I don't care if it's Saturday. I don't care if it's the weekend. Someone in the state of Oregon is going to hear what happened tonight, and they're going to hear it before Hagan's version becomes the only version." Sullivan reached for the phone. "Declan." Declan looked up. His eyes were red. His hand was bleeding through the gauze again. He held Noah against his chest with his good arm, and the boy's face was buried in his neck, and Declan's expression was the expression of a man who has been pushed past every limit he thought he had, and has discovered that the limits were never where he placed them. "Record everything," Ronan said. "Your phone, the prepaid, I don't care what device. Record Noah's statement, record Claire's statement, record the Hale boys' account, timestamps, details, everything." He turned to Mason. "You're going to tell me exactly what you saw yesterday. The field, the backpack, the dogs, everything from the moment school let out to the moment you walked through our gate, and you're going to say it into a recording device, clearly, with your full name and today's date. Can you do that?" Mason looked at the man standing in front of him. A biker. An outlaw. A combat veteran with a braided gray beard and bloodshot eyes and a leather vest soaked with rain. A man the entire town had spent 2 decades fearing. A man who had spent the last 12 hours protecting 3 children he owed nothing to, facing down threats he didn't create, absorbing betrayals he didn't deserve, and standing on a rainy road telling a corrupt deputy to move his car. "Yeah," Mason said. "I can do that." Ronan nodded, just once. Then he turned to the window and looked out at his riders in the rain, the dark shapes along the fence line, the motorcycles parked at angles, the men standing post in the freezing November morning because he had asked them to and because the asking was enough. Outside, the sleet turned back to rain. The sky showed no sign of clearing. And somewhere in Garfield County, on every law enforcement radio and every dispatch frequency and every patrol car dashboard, the name Iron Veil was being broadcast alongside the words abduction and suspect and armed and dangerous. And the distance between the truth and the story being told about it was growing wider with every minute. And the only people who knew what had really happened were locked behind a ranch gate on a private road, recording testimony into phones with shaking hands, racing a clock that was already running out. Sullivan made 11 calls in 90 minutes. Mason knew this because he sat at the kitchen table 6 feet away, recording his own statement into a prepaid phone, and between sentences he could hear Sullivan's voice through the thin wall of the farmhouse office. Calm, persistent, methodical, repeating the same information to different people with the patience of a man hammering the same nail until it finally sinks flush. Most of the calls ended the same way. Weekend. Voicemail. Automated systems that looped through menu options designed to exhaust the caller into hanging up. The state of Oregon, it turned out, operated on business hours even when children were in danger. The 12th call connected. Mason heard the change in Sullivan's voice, a subtle lift, a sharpening, the way a radio signal clarifies when the antenna finds the right angle. He stopped recording and listened. "My name is Sullivan Dwyer. I'm calling on behalf of a 10-year-old material witness whose life has been threatened. I have testimony, timestamps, and documentation of an active cover-up involving the Garfield County Sheriff's Office. I need to speak with Investigator Dorsey or his supervisor. This is not a request." A pause. A long one. Mason could hear the clock on the kitchen wall, and the rain on the roof, and Eli's breathing from the couch in the next room, and the faint rumble of motorcycle engines outside where Ronan's riders held their positions along the fence line, like sentinels carved from wet leather and exhaustion. Then Sullivan's voice again, different now, lower, faster, more detailed. He was talking to someone who was listening, really listening. Mason caught fragments through the wall. Graylin Halling, Deputy Wren, BOLO, filed under false pretenses. 3 children. Threats against a minor. Evidence cleaned from the field. A mole inside the club named Kessler, employed by the target of the original investigation. The call lasted 37 minutes. When Sullivan emerged from the office, his face carried something Mason hadn't seen on any adult in 24 hours. Not relief. It was too early and too raw for relief. But direction. The face of a man who has been pushing against a locked door and has finally heard the bolt slide. Dorsey's supervisor is a woman named Keene, Assistant Director of the State Criminal Investigations Division. Sullivan looked at Ronan, who was standing by the fireplace with a mug of coffee he still hadn't drunk. "She's sending a team, 2 investigators and a state police escort. They'll be here by noon." The room exhaled. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody cheered. Nobody collapsed. The exhale was collective and nearly silent, a simultaneous release of pressure from every person in the farmhouse who had been holding their breath since the note was found on the gate. Since the cargo disappeared, since Kessler vanished, since Deputy Wren blocked a road with a sedan and a badge, and the practiced arrogance of a man who believed his uniform made him untouchable. Ronan set his coffee mug on the mantel. His hand, Mason noticed, was trembling, just slightly, just enough to make the surface of the cold coffee ripple. He saw Mason seeing it and didn't look away, didn't hide it, just let a 12-year-old boy witness the fact that the man who had held everything together for 20 hours was reaching the edge of what holding together required. "Noon," Ronan said. "Noon. That's 3 hours." "I know." Ronan turned to the window. His riders were still out there, dark shapes in the gray rain, stationed along the fence, bikes angled toward the road, faces turned outward. They'd been out there since arrival. No one had asked to come inside. No one had complained. They stood in the freezing November rain because standing was what was required, and requiring was all Ronan had needed to do. "Tell them," Ronan said quietly, "tell them 3 hours." Sullivan went outside. Through the window, Mason watched him walk the fence line, stopping at each rider, speaking briefly, placing a hand on a shoulder or an arm. Each man nodded. Each man stayed. The hours passed with the particular slowness of time measured in danger. Claire fed Noah in the kitchen, scrambled eggs that Sullivan's cousin had prepared, toast cut into triangles, orange juice in a glass Mason suspected was reserved for company. Noah ate with the mechanical focus of a child whose body was demanding fuel, regardless of what his mind was processing. His glasses had been lost in the shed, so he squinted at his plate with the concentrated effort of someone trying to see a world that had become permanently blurred. Eli slept on the couch under the quilt. Linda sat beside him, awake, her hand resting on his shoulder. She hadn't slept at all. The skin beneath her eyes was dark and thin, almost translucent, and she stared at the fire with the expression of a woman performing calculations she would never share. The cost of the cannery shift she'd missed, the rent that was already late, the school clothes the boys needed, and now this. This impossible thing that had happened to her children in a town she'd chosen because it was supposed to be safe. Mason sat by the window. He watched the road. At 11:47 a.m., two black SUVs turned onto the private road. They moved slowly, deliberate, official, the kind of vehicles that announce their purpose through weight and color and the way they take up space. Behind them, a state police cruiser, lights off but visible, its presence a statement that required no activation. Ronan met them at the gate. Mason watched through the window as a woman stepped out of the lead SUV, mid-40s, dark coat, no umbrella, her hair pulled back tight, her face carrying the expression of someone who has read a file and is now seeing the physical reality it described. She showed credentials. Ronan examined them with the careful attention of a man who had learned not to trust badges. Then he opened the gate. What followed was the longest afternoon of Mason's life. The investigators set up in the farmhouse dining room. Their names were Keene and Morrow. Keene was the assistant director Sullivan had spoken with, sharp, direct, with a voice that cut through ambiguity the way a scalpel cuts through gauze. Morrow was younger, quieter, a man who listened with his whole body and took notes in handwriting so small it looked like code. They interviewed everyone, separately, one at a time. Claire first, then Declan, then Sullivan, then Ronan. Each interview lasted between 30 and 45 minutes. The farmhouse was small enough that Mason could hear the murmur of voices through the walls, but not the words. And the not knowing was its own kind of torment, the sound of his story being told by other people in rooms he couldn't enter. When his turn came, Mason sat across from Keene at the dining room table. A digital recorder sat between them, its red light steady and unblinking. Morrow sat to the side with his notebook. The state police officer stood near the door, not as a guard but as a witness, a uniformed presence that made the proceedings official in a way that felt both reassuring and immense. "Start from the beginning," Keene said. "Take your time." Mason started from the beginning. He told her about walking home from school, about Eli mentioning that Noah wasn't at pickup, about the silence at the warehouse, about the backpack by the fence. He told her about Ronan's face when he saw the bag, the controlled reaction, the operational shift, about the map table and the radios and the men who organized a search, while the sheriff's office did nothing for 4 hours. He told her about the barking dogs, about the convoy, about Noah in the shed, about the cargo that disappeared, about the note on the gate, about Kessler's wrong expression and his silent departure, and the gray lawn employment history hidden in a prospect application that nobody had thought to question. He told her about Deputy Wren on the road, about the sedan across both lanes, about Ronan standing in the rain telling a man with a badge to move his car, about the Bolo broadcast that turned protectors into suspects and truth into noise. He told her everything. It took 52 minutes. When he finished, Keene turned off the recorder. She looked at him for a long moment, and Mason saw something in her eyes that he recognized because he'd seen it in Ronan's eyes 20 hours ago outside the warehouse. Recognition. The acknowledgement that the person sitting across from you has shown you something you didn't expect to find. "You're 12 years old," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You understand that what you've told me may be used in legal proceedings?" "Yes, ma'am." Keene nodded. She stood up. She placed one hand flat on the table and leaned forward slightly, and for a moment she wasn't an assistant director or an investigator or a representative of the state. She was a person looking at a child who had done something extraordinary without knowing it was extraordinary, because to him it was simply the thing that needed to be done. "You did well," she said. Mason didn't respond. He didn't need to. The weight of the words was enough. The arrests began that evening. Mason didn't witness them directly, but the information filtered through the farmhouse in fragments, radio transmissions, phone calls, Sullivan relaying updates from Keene's team with the methodical precision of a man reading coordinates. State police executed a search warrant on gray lawn hauling and salvage at 4:15 p.m. They found a warehouse containing commercial equipment, construction materials, and automotive parts, none of it documented, none of it traceable to legitimate purchase, all of it matching descriptions from a string of commercial thefts spanning 3 counties over 8 months. Ray Alderman was arrested at his home at 5:30 p.m. He said nothing. The man in the red jacket was identified as Frank Telford, a gray lawn employee with prior convictions for receiving stolen goods. He was arrested at a motel outside Ridgeport at 6 p.m. The blue pickup truck from the road was registered in his name. Deputy Martin Wren was placed on administrative leave at 6:45 p.m. pending investigation. The bolo on the Iron Vale's van was rescinded. Kessler was picked up at a gas station in Grants Pass at 8 p.m. He was driving south. He had a prepaid phone containing text messages to a number registered to Greylon Hauling. The messages dated back 11 months. 11 months of check-ins, updates, locations, and the quiet betrayal of men who had called him brother. Sheriff Hagan was not arrested, not that day. But Keene told Ronan, in a brief conversation on the farmhouse porch that Mason overheard through the screen door, that the investigation into the Garfield County Sheriff's Office was being escalated to the State Attorney General's office, and that Hagan's cooperation with the Alderman operation, whether active or passive, would be a central focus. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the clean, complete justice that stories promise and life rarely delivers. But it was enough. Enough to dismantle the machinery that had hidden stolen goods in fields and threatened a child and weaponized a badge, and planted a spy inside a family of men who had already been betrayed by every institution they'd ever served. Enough to let 3 children go home. They left the ranch at 9 p.m. Sullivan drove the van. The motorcycles followed, fewer now, the formation looser, the riders visibly exhausted, their movements carrying the particular heaviness of men who have been running on adrenaline for too long and have finally been given permission to feel the weight. The rain had stopped sometime in the late afternoon, and the roads were wet but clear, and the sky had opened to reveal a scattering of stars that Mason hadn't expected, pinpricks of light in the November dark that seemed too clean, too precise, too ordinary for a night that had been anything but. They drove through Millhaven at reduced speed. The town was quiet. Saturday night, and Patty's Diner was the only building on Main Street with its lights on. A warm yellow glow behind steamed windows. The parking lot half full with pickups and sedans belonging to people who didn't know what had happened and might never know the full story. Sullivan pulled the van into Patty's lot. Mason didn't understand why until he saw Ronan's motorcycle pull in beside them, and then Briggs, and then 3 more riders, and then the rest, one by one, until the lot was lined with Harleys, and the diner's windows reflected chrome and leather, and the faces of men who looked like they'd been through a war, which, in every way that mattered, they had. Ronan dismounted. He walked to the van and opened the rear door and looked at the people inside. At Linda and her boys, at Claire and Noah, at Declan with his wrecked hand and his hollow eyes, and said, "Come inside, you need to eat." Nobody argued. The diner was half full of people who stared. Of course they stared. 14 bikers walking through the door of Patty's Diner on a Saturday night with 3 children and 2 women, all of them looking like they'd been dragged through a week's worth of living in 24 hours. Conversations stopped. Forks paused. A waitress behind the counter held a coffee pot in mid-pour and watched them file past with an expression that traveled from alarm to confusion to something that didn't have a name. They took the back booths. 3 of them, pushed together. The bikers filled the seats with the efficient density of men accustomed to occupying spaces designed for fewer people. The children were placed in the center, Noah between Claire and Declan, Mason and Eli flanking Linda. The configuration was instinctive, not planned. A protective geometry that placed the vulnerable at the core and the dangerous at the edges. Ronan ordered for the table. Coffee, water, whatever's on the grill. The waitress, her name tag said Gloria, wrote nothing down. She looked at Ronan's face, at the exhaustion carved into it, at the blood-spotted bandage on Declan's hand, at the children's hollow eyes, and she went to the kitchen and came back 10 minutes later with plates she hadn't been asked for. Burgers, fries, grilled cheese for the kids, pie, more coffee. She set it all down without a word and refilled cups without being asked, and when she passed Ronan's booth, she put her hand briefly on his shoulder, just a touch, just a moment, and then moved on. Mason ate. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until the food was in front of him. The burger tasted like the most significant thing he'd ever put in his mouth, not because it was good, but because it was real and warm and present, and the act of eating it meant that the worst part was over, and he was sitting in a booth in a diner in a town he hated, and he was alive, and his brother was alive, and Noah was alive, And the men who had made that possible were sitting around him eating the same food and drinking the same coffee and existing in the same moment with the same exhaustion and the same quiet, battered, unspoken understanding of what they'd just been through together. Nobody talked about what had happened. Not there. Not yet. The conversation, such as it was, consisted of small things. Pass the ketchup, you want more coffee, eat your fries, you too. The domestic language of people sharing a meal, unremarkable and mundane and more meaningful than any speech could have been. Eli leaned against Mason's shoulder. His eyes were half closed, his body finally surrendering to the sleep it had been fighting for over a day. His hand found Mason's under the table and held it, and Mason let him, and neither of them said anything because the holding was the saying. Across the booth, Noah was drawing on a napkin with a pen Gloria had left on the table. His hand moved in small, careful strokes, building something Mason couldn't see from his angle. Claire watched him draw with an expression that was trying to be normal, trying to be a mother watching her son do a harmless thing in a safe place, and almost succeeding. Declan sat beside them, his injured hand resting on the table, the gauze unwinding slightly at the wrist. He was staring at the coffee in front of him with the 1,000-yard focus of a man who has come back from somewhere and is still calculating the distance. Ronan sat at the end of the booth nearest the door. He'd positioned himself there without discussion, the seat with the widest view of the entrance, the seat a man chooses when he isn't done watching, even though the watching should be over. His coffee cup was empty. He held it anyway, both hands wrapped around the ceramic, the warmth long gone but the habit remaining. Sullivan slid into the seat across from him. The two men looked at each other across the formica table and the remnants of a meal and the accumulated weight of what they'd built and what had been broken and what they were now, somehow, going to have to rebuild. "Kessler," Sullivan said, quietly. "I know. 14 months. I know. We vetted him. I vetted him. The references checked out. The background checked out. Everything checked out." Ronan set the empty cup down. He turned it slowly on the saucer, a full rotation, watching the light move across the ceramic surface. "Some things check out because they're designed to check out," Ronan said. "That's not a failure of the process. That's a failure of the people who built the lie. It feels like a failure. It's supposed to. That's how it works. They plant someone inside, and when you find out, the discovery itself becomes the weapon. You stop trusting. You start looking sideways at every man who rides with you. The betrayal doesn't end when the mole leaves. It just changes shape." Sullivan was quiet for a moment. "So how do we stop it from changing shape?" Ronan looked across the diner, at his men, at the children, at the waitress refilling cups and the cook visible through the kitchen window and the other customers who had gone back to their meals but kept glancing over with expressions that were slowly, incrementally, shifting from suspicion to something else. Not trust? Not yet. But the space where trust might eventually grow if given enough time and enough evidence that the men in leather vests were not what the stories said they were. "We do what we did tonight," Ronan said. "We show up. We stay. We don't flinch." He stood. He walked to the counter and paid for the entire table, every plate, every cup, every slice of pie. Gloria took the cash and looked at him, and something passed between them that Mason would later understand was the beginning of a very long, very slow change in the way Millhaven saw the men at Black Ridge Warehouse. "Thank you," Gloria said. "For what?" "For bringing them in here. People need to see this." Ronan didn't respond. He folded his wallet and put it back in his vest and walked back to the booth and told everyone it was time to go. Outside, the air was cold and clean and carried the mineral smell of rain-washed concrete. The parking lot gleamed under the diner's neon sign, Patty's, in blue and white, the apostrophe flickering intermittently, casting a stuttering light across the Harleys lined up along the curb. The sky had cleared further. More stars now. The kind of sky that makes you feel small in a way that's not diminishing but orienting. A reminder that the world is larger than any single night, any single crisis, any single town at the bottom of a valley in western Oregon. Sullivan drove the Mercers home first. Declan rode beside the van, his injured hand gripping the handlebar with a determination that overrode pain. When they reached the house on the east side of town, Ronan posted 2 riders on the street. Not permanently, just for the night. just long enough for a mother and her son to walk through their own front door and close it and lock it and stand in their own hallway and breathe. The Hale house was next. Sullivan pulled the van to the curb, and Linda gathered her boys and stepped out into the cold. The house was dark. She'd left in such a hurry that morning that she hadn't turned on the porch light, and the building sat in shadow, small and tired and exactly what it was, a rented two-bedroom in a town that didn't take care of its own. Mason stood on the sidewalk. Eli was already inside, moving through the dark hallway with the muscle memory of a boy who knew every creaking floorboard and every light switch. Linda waited at the front door, holding it open, looking back at her older son with the patience of a woman who understood that some things take a moment longer. Mason turned around. Ronan was still on his motorcycle at the curb, engine off, hands on the tank. The neon from Patty's, 3 blocks away, caught the chrome of his bike in a faint blue glow that made the machine look like something from another world. Mason walked to him. He stood on the sidewalk and Ronan sat on the bike, and the height difference put them almost at eye level. Almost. Mason still had to look up slightly, and Ronan still had to look down, and the angle was the angle of a man and a boy who are not yet equals, but who have been through something that changes the definition of the word. Mason didn't know what to say. He'd been talking for 24 hours, to Eli, to Ronan, to investigators, and to recording devices, through radios, across rooms full of men who listened, and now, at the end of it, standing on a sidewalk in front of his own house in the dark, he couldn't find a single word that fit. He held out his hand. Ronan looked at it. At the small, dirty hand of a 12-year-old boy who had picked up a backpack and walked through a gate and said the word dogs and changed everything that followed. He reached out and took the hand, and his grip was warm and rough and careful. The grip of a man who understood that some things, held too tightly, break, and held too loosely, are lost. They shook once. A single, firm, silent exchange that carried more weight than any speech could bear. Ronan let go. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out something small, a patch, iron-on, circular, embroidered with the winged gear and anvil of the Iron Veil. He held it out. "You ever need anything," he said. "You come to the warehouse. You show them this. You don't knock. You walk in." Mason took the patch. It was warm from Ronan's body heat. He closed his fingers around it and felt the embroidery press into his palm, the wings, the gear, the anvil, and understood that what he was holding was not a piece of fabric, but an invitation into a family that chose its members not by blood, but by the willingness to stand when standing was hard. "Thank you," Mason said. Ronan shook his head, slowly, once. "You walk through the gate," he said. "You don't thank people for doing what you started." He kicked the engine to life. The Harley growled beneath him, a deep rolling sound that vibrated through the sidewalk and up through Mason's shoes and into his chest, where it settled alongside his heartbeat like a second pulse. Ronan pulled away from the curb. The motorcycle moved down the street, its taillight a single red point in the darkness, growing smaller, dimmer, until it turned the corner at the end of the block and disappeared. But the sound lingered. It carried through the cold air and bounced off the houses and the empty storefronts and the closed-up buildings of a town that had been afraid of a sound it didn't understand, and it faded so slowly that Mason couldn't identify the exact moment it stopped. He stood on the sidewalk for a long time after it was gone. Then he turned and walked up the steps and through the door his mother was holding and into the warm, dark hallway of his house. Linda closed the door behind him. She locked it. She put her hand on his shoulder, the same shoulder where Ronan's hand had rested 20 hours ago, when a different kind of weight had been placed and a different kind of safety had been offered. "You okay?" she said. Mason thought about the question. He thought about the backpack and the fence and the map table and the radios and the men on motorcycles riding into frozen fields. He thought about Noah in the dark and Declan's breaking voice and Sullivan's 11 phone calls and Ronan standing in the rain telling a corrupt deputy to move his car. He thought about Kessler's colorless eyes and Wren's silver badge and the white van with green lettering that had carried stolen goods and shattered trust through the same roads he walked every day. He thought about the patch in his pocket, still warm. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay." He walked down the hallway to the bedroom he shared with Eli. His brother was already in bed, the blankets pulled to his chin, his eyes open in the dark. Mason. Yeah. Are they going to be all right? The bikers? Mason sat on the edge of his bed. He pulled off his shoes. The same shoes he'd been wearing for 26 hours. The laces still damp from the field. The soles still carrying mud from the access road. He set them on the floor and lay back and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around him. The familiar creaks and groans of a building that was old and imperfect and his. Yeah, he said. They're going to be all right. Eli was quiet for a moment, then his voice, smaller, closer to sleep than waking, carrying the weight of a 10-year-old's understanding of a world that had just become larger and more complicated and more painful and more surprising than he had previously imagined. They weren't what everyone said. No, they were the opposite. Mason turned his head and looked at his brother's face in the dark. The outline of it, the shape, the faint reflection of streetlight in his eyes. Go to sleep, Eli. Eli closed his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing evened out, deepened, and he was gone, carried into whatever place children go when the day has been too much and the body decides that enough is enough. Mason stayed awake a while longer. He lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of Millhaven at night, a dog barking somewhere on the east side, a car passing on Route 31, the distant hum of the cannery in Ridgeport running its overnight shift. The sounds of a town that was the same as it had been yesterday and would be the same tomorrow, except that underneath the sameness, something had shifted. A fault line had been exposed. The ground had moved. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the iron veil patch. He held it against his chest, over his heart, and felt the embroidered wings beneath his fingers. Somewhere across town, at the edge of the valley, where the residential streets gave way to gravel access roads and old industrial lots, the lights at Black Ridge Warehouse were on. Men were inside. Coffee was brewing. Tools were hanging on pegboards. A half-restored motorcycle sat on a hydraulic lift, waiting. And the sound of Harleys, faint but unmistakable, drifted through the November air like a promise that didn't need words, that the men behind those walls would be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, carrying their scars and their silence and their willingness to stand between the world and the people it forgot, for no reason other than the fact that someone had to, and they had decided a long time ago that someone would be them. Mason closed his eyes. The patch was warm against his chest. He slept.